You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside the capital of the United States of America. It's time now for the show that brings you the truth about the foundations of our world. In the independent corner, I'm investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into headlines here. We've got a few, so I'll just start right in. First up today, the Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that state faithless elector laws are constitutional. These laws allow states to remove or fine electoral college delegates who don't vote for the presidential candidate they were pledged to support. This will undoubtedly have a significant impact on the upcoming election as well as on other elections coming in the future. Again, this is a sort of big move in terms of the shape that the Electoral College plays in democracy in America. The UK has passed a raft of new sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against 49 officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. Just over half of those officials are in Russia, where they targeted 25 individuals they associated with the death in prison of Russian tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky. Most notably, they targeted Russia's top prosecutor, Alexander Bostrykin. We'll have more on that at 8:15 when we're talking with Alex Craner. They also armed forces. And in North Korea, their only named target was Kim Jong-ho, a senior official they said was in charge of the country's prison system. The UN is warning that the novel coronavirus pandemic is causing serious disruption to HIV treatment in many parts of the world, with shipments of medical supplies disrupted by broken supply chains. California, meanwhile, is delaying the state assembly's return to work. This comes after Democrat Autumn Burke of Marina del Rey and 4 others who worked in the building tested positive for coronavirus. In Georgia, Atlanta's mayor, Keisha Bottoms, has tested positive for COVID-19, although she has said, technically she's tested positive for coronavirus. She said she has had no symptoms. She is seen as a possible candidate for Joe Biden's VP pick. And brief sports news here. In football, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes may have signed the most lucrative contract extension in history. That's the rumor, at least. Meanwhile, in baseball, the Nationals and the Astros, the 2 teams in last year's World Series, have each canceled training camp workouts today due to delays in coronavirus testing results. Meanwhile, in Asia, stock markets ended low yesterday. Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 dropped 0.4%. South Korea's Kospi lost early gains to decline nearly 1%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng dropped 0.7%, while the Shanghai Composite gained 1.2%. This also comes as TikTok has joined a list of social media platforms withdrawing from Hong Kong, alongside Facebook, Google, and Twitter, over worries that they will be held culpable for individuals identified by the government as dissidents. Also, I'm going to throw this in here. I saw this. Mike Pompeo last night on Fox said he was considering, along with other members of the White House, the federal government, were considering bans on Chinese apps, including TikTok. That's early, but that would be consistent with the trend these days. And my last story today, a judge on Monday ordered the Dakota Access Pipeline shut down for additional environmental review. This comes more than 3 years after it began pumping oil. This also hands a victory to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and delivers a blow to President Donald Trump's efforts to weaken public health and environmental protections his administration views as obstacles to business. You are all caught up. That's the news. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what is your top priority today?
I'm glad you asked that. So, Shane, you can't tell by looking at me. You may not even be able to tell by talking to me, but I have scars. Deep, indelible, often unacknowledged, unseen, but they're there nevertheless. Scars. Typically, I do pretty good at trying to master what took place in 2016 and 2020. And I try to basically push that down, especially with the primary being over with. in real terms, with Joe Biden basically winning the nomination and will be coronated as such. But those scars at times get the better of me, and at times they fester and they bleed and they leak out. And this is one of those grotesque moments. I was a Sanders supporter. I think that was very, very clear. My want, my wish, my hope that we could have somewhat of a better system and a better organization of affairs. We may not necessarily be able to get to where I want to go, which is basically somewhat of a cashless society. We may not even be able to get to the point where I want to go in regards to just changes that I believe are just essential in order to get rid of and ameliorate the worst aspects of our economic system. Be it the people who are living on the street, be it the people without health care, the millions of people, be it the people who are dead-end jobs or BS jobs that they hate, that they have no agency in, that have appalling conditions, and yet they have to go back and back and back, not because they love it, but because they're forced to do it, and then have to deal with people screaming that that is in some way tantamount to freedom. That's not freedom. I wanted a better world. Even if I can't get my Hyperloop, even if I can't get my flying cars, at the very least, we can deal with the worst aspects of our system that we recognize are horrible aspects. When you get the majority of the population saying, yes, we want Medicare for all, 88% of Democrats, 70% of everybody else. When you get the majority of the public saying, yes, we want to get rid of student debt. It is horrendous that kids who try to get an education that is for the best interest of this country, not just themselves, and it's something that we as a nation should aspire to have our kids do. The majority of the population agrees. Democratic Party, Republican Party, political instrument says kick rocks. I mean, you go down the list with us. A wealth tax, increasing wages to at least $15 an hour minimum wage because they have not in any way caught up with productivity. While that productivity gain had to go somewhere, it didn't just fickle out in space. Well, it did go somewhere. It went to the top 1%. And the higher up you go into that of the 0.1, it goes there. I keep saying, Obama gave 95% of the income to the top 1%. Trump is going to best that number. Even after an economic crash where capitalism hit the skids, the causers, or the people who caused that, didn't go to prison. Obama stepped between them, threw his body on the line, said, I'm between you and the pitchforks. I'm between you and the pitchforks. Now, he didn't necessarily have that much verve and energy when it came to protecting homeowners. No, the pitchforks, he did. Even with Occupy Wall Street, a mass uprising of human beings that said, we're sick of the system, even creating the notion of the 1% and the 99%. He even worked to put those people down while adopting and appropriating the language of the movement itself. I have scars. Sanders, it became clear. And when this became clear, the dollop of hope in me died all at once. When it became clear that despite having the rhetoric and the temperament in order to try to wage a war against a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, basically a political system that have created the outcomes of this level of disparity between different groups. He seemed incapable of waging that war, despite having the language and forming that language and getting a lot of people on board with that language to potentially wage that quote-unquote political revolution. Despite his words, he didn't and couldn't follow through with deed to match up with those words. If you tell me that climate change is an existential threat, that life on this planet in and of itself is going to be materially harmed, that us as human beings, our grandkids or our grandkids' grandkids, may not necessarily be able to live in the world with the opportunities and the habitable space that we did, because we and our previous generations, especially up to the point of the Industrial Revolution, has basically destroyed the planet. We have dumped tons of carbon into our atmosphere. That is a waste product. Now, if they were dumping this into the ocean, or if they were dumping this just outside of your house, you would have feelings about that. But again, this is something that you can't necessarily see. It's a conceptual thing. And so they're able to basically get along with it, where very few companies are in charge of like 70% of the waste material that's in the sky. Now, if you tell me that, and you tell me the world is at stake, the Republicans just say it doesn't exist, but you, Sanders, you tell me the world is at stake. But then you can't bring yourself to go after Joe Biden and the perpetrators of that system that has done all of these, that has put the world at stake in the first place. Democrats will come out and say, we believe in climate change. However, we need to take an incrementalist approach to dealing with the end of the world. That's ludicrous. And so the guy who had the opportunity to kind of make that case, the dollop of hope in me died when it realized either he was unable to pursue that in real terms or didn't want to. Now, the catch is, whether he wanted to or not, whether he was capable of not, whether this was some kind of gimmick in order to sheepdog or not, he did have the language and the voice for it. He gave brought a lot of people into this particular political discussion when economics, wealth tax, Green New Deal, healthcare, when all of that stuff was not even on the table. He put it there, and he got a lot of people in line to back those policies. Why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because an article by the New York Times has perturbed me a bit. The New York Times comes out with America needs some repairs, here's where to start. Now, people can make the case that Sanders was maybe a little too late, or this crisis that we have, all of these crises, economic, social, where you have all of these people coming up, homeowners going bust. If Sanders had won this primary, what would be the language he was using? Would he be hiding in his basement, or would he make an assertive argument for change? He was calling for a political revolution. Clearly, he would make an assertive argument for change. And yet, all of these people and institutions went after him whole hog, including the Democratic Party itself and media, New York Times particularly. Let's hear Sanders' clip for the moment. Sanders is talking to the New York Times. Let's hear the New York Times make their case. Let's play the clip.
What about the fact that Trump has touched a chord in 40 to 44% of the people? What about that issue? It's like Trump is a symptom of a widespread problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you address that?
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah. People are, in many cases in this country, working longer hours for low wages. You are aware of the fact that an unprecedented way life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope, and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide. And when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're going to have a good job, and you're going to have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we got to do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority, and you demonize that minority, and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say that's the cause of your problem.
Right there. New York Times comes out with an article says America needs some repairs. Here's where to start. That same New York Times voted for Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren. That's the guy who you wanted. Look, we either need to discover that love is indeed our only salvation with an ideology that is true, as invisible as breathing, or we desiccate alone, clawing and gouging out our eyes in some undignified pursuit for imaginary things when abundance is in our grasp. The person who was making that case was Sanders, and the person who they vilified, attacked, who called racist, sexist, bigoted, Trump, all of those things, ends up getting the last laugh. Because the one name that they didn't have in this piece was Bernie Sanders, and that's the one person who was in all of this process who was calling for what this very specific, trying to bend the arc of history itself. Shane, we only have about 30 seconds to a minute left, and we could talk about it a little bit more in the next segment. But Sanders was perfect for this moment. And that was the one guy that the New York Times and all of these other publications attacked relentlessly. And now, all of a sudden, they're taking his mantra.
I'd say he was imperfect in two key ways. He wasn't for whatever reason strong or able enough to stand up to the DNC like you were saying. And then two, geopolitics and our foreign interventions. He didn't really go after that stuff. He cozied up to the DNC party line. So on those two counts, and I think that the second one is really tied really deeply into America's economic basis. We were talking about this again off show the other day. We've talked about it on show too. We can come back to that conversation though. On the other side, going to go into a break in a second. We're also taking calls this next segment if you want to call in. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, though, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. Again, if you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. If you want to catch us on the radio, I'll give you a quick tip on where you can. In the DC area, you can listen to us 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, we're on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, 1140 AM. If you want to catch us online, we're also live on Periscope and YouTube right now. Periscope's on Twitter. You can find us twitter.com/faultlinesradio. Over on YouTube, check out the Fault Lines Radio channel. Also, check out the Jamarl Thomas channel. Just do a quick search for Jamarl Thomas. You'll find us live in both of those places. We're also a bunch of other places, too. Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. The list goes on and on, although I think it actually ends there. Regardless, though, let's get back into this conversation real quick. So, yeah, I'm gonna come at this from another sort of weird, different economic perspective. And you know what? We can relate this directly to Sanders. I heard the other day that there are these two definitions of invest. And I'll just throw this out there. I don't know how true this is, but this seemed pretty true to me when I read it, especially in the sort of social rhetorical sense. One is investment in terms of investing in human capital, investing in industrial capacity, investing in physical resources. Another is basically speculation. You're investing in a stake of a company or a stake of an entity, and you're trying to see how that entity will do. You're buying in with the idea that at some point you're going to sell out. And it seems like we've fallen nationally and internationally into the second category. We're not investing in our human capacity nearly as much as we could be or should be. We're not investing in our industrial capacity or our state capacity nearly as much as we should be. We're not investing in those things. Instead, we're investing, basically drawing out this thin line that we're trying to walk on, and eventually we're going to have to walk off of it. This also applies internationally. Other countries are investing in us technically, but they're not investing in our resources. They're not investing to build us up. They're basically investing for a stake in this giant geopolitical monster that we've created. And those both seem interconnected to me. Those both seem deeply tied. We've talked about these issues with the reserve currency. My point is, if Sanders isn't willing to go after the militaristic stuff, he's not going to have a chance at changing the economy. And we need both. Now, that's the thing. Trump, for everything that was wrong, there were two things that struck me when he was running, at least in terms of what he was talking about. One, he was talking about ending overseas wars, pulling back internationally. And two, he was talking about bringing manufacturing back home. Now, if we did both of those things, and we focused on how to distribute the gains in a way that's not unfair to anybody, that's not unfair to the people who are producing, that's not unfair to the people who are investing, it's not unfair to people. We can do that. Another perspective on this, the people on the left don't like capitalism and the people on the right don't like socialism, but maybe we need more of each. Maybe we need more room for ingenuity, more room for free expression and free productivity, and maybe we need better ways of handling social progress, handling technological progress, and distributing the gains so that the society as a whole is healthy. I don't hear that conversation, man. I want to have that conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so he did try to have that conversation. I mean, that was Sanders' entire platform. Also, I want to push back on the notion that he wasn't talking about international politics. He was. If you remember, he was against the strike for Soleimani. He was against the Honduras or the Bolivia coup. He even called it a coup at the moment that it took place when everybody else was kind of shucking and jiving on that point. He was against the attacks on Venezuela. He even went so far as to try to put out legislation to stop the war in Yemen, something that the other people were basically on board for, and making the argument that, hey, our engagement in Syria looks illegal also. So one of the things that he was attacking in 2016 on was foreign policy. So in this term, he did beef up on the issue of foreign policy and was against the Democratic's typical platform on that stuff. I do agree with you that he should have been louder. And I do agree with you, he should have been stronger, and he seemed completely incapable of waging that war. On the other part, look, capitalism doesn't care about productivity in the sense of engineering or whatever. They care about economic growth. How much cash can we make? And if the incentives for making cash boil down to, okay, we're just going to make money off of money as opposed to make money off of building things, then that's what they're going to do, because that's the whole point. If you're selling McDonald's, or you're working at McDonald's and you're selling hot dogs or hamburgers, the point of that is not the hamburger. The point of that is the profit. And so when you get that hamburger is an expense. The productivity or the products that go into making that hamburger is an expense. So you try to find the cheapest product so you can expropriate the most cash to the top. That's with everything. And so when you get to this final situation of, all right, we're just going to make money off of money, well, that's a problem. And I agree with you, that's a problem. But the catch is, every incentive in the world of your political system tells them to do just that. And so that's what they do, because that's what the whole point is. I mean, am I wrong on that? Do you think I'm wrong on that? When you have a drug company, that drug company produces a drug. Do you believe they're producing the drug for the sake of the drug, or do you think they're producing the drug for the sake of the profit?
I'll put it like this. I think we'd be a lot richer as a country right now. I think that we would have made a lot more profit if in the mid-1940s we hadn't decided to take on this imperialistic, sort of friendly, grandfatherly, oppressive, tyrannical role in the context of the world. We made a lot of decisions that sacrificed our own health, that sacrificed wages of Americans. That wasn't a forethought out, very conscientious decision as far as I can tell. It was reflexive. We were trying to maintain our global standing, all this stuff. But when it comes to capitalism, again, like I was saying, we need more of that, in my opinion, but we also need more of the socialism, too. Right now, we're so pitted against each other, not necessarily you and I, but ideologically or economically or whatever.
Real quick, I don't understand by we need more capitalism. I mean, we have capitalism through the wazoo at this point. So what's the more capitalism part that you believe that capitalism contributes in this case, that you need more of?
I'll put it like this. I don't think that real innovation, the potential for real big profit, like in the case of the Hyperloop, for instance, you bring up the Hyperloop. I think the Hyperloop would be profitable. I think it would be totally profitable. It would just take long-term investments that aren't available right now because everybody's frenzied trying to make short-term investments, because long-term investments have become really hard in America because we've gutted our manufacturing base, because we've gutted basically every sector of our economy that isn't either oriented around services, intellectual property, or finance.
Stay right there for me. Now, why do you think that's true? Why do you think that happened?
Our imperialism.
No. That's not imperialism. I mean, this is the point that I'm making. I'm making the point that capitalism and imperialism are linked. When you get a country, for example, that says, all right, we can make a product cheaper in China, is it more profitable to make a product in China where you can cut wages to, let's say, $3 as opposed to paying somebody 15 or 16 bucks? Will the capitalists, with the idea of making profit, do that?
I think they would.
And actually, a rational act, right?
No, I don't think it is, and here's why. There's also this conversation about human capital.
Wait. You're saying you don't think they would do that? But that's literally what they've done.
Yeah, but there was this tie-in with the larger push that the United States had at the time, which was, again, to maintain these flows of quote-unquote free trade around the world to keep the Soviet Union hemmed in. And that was a large part of why flows of investment shifted out of the States. It's not just that it was more profitable to do that overseas, because in some ways it was, but that's a short-term decision. In the long run, I would argue, looking at the global economic crisis we seem to be entering right now, we're constantly flirting with the edge of. This is not a set of rational decisions made by rational actors trying to maximize profit. No, but it is.
I think that's the point I'm trying to make to you. It is a perfectly rational act. If you have a company, that company has this philosophical point of view of we need to maximize our profit. You notice that instead of paying workers $15 or $20 here in the United States, you could pay a worker in China or in Thailand or one of these other countries $3 an hour. It is perfectly rational for you to push for trade legislation, for you to get rid of tariffs for those things coming into the country, and you ship the jobs overseas. You can do that for decades. And that's literally what has been taking place in our society.
Here's the thing. Over what time scale? Like, if we're thinking in terms of this abstract process of pursuing profit, it's hit its dead end as far as I can tell. The globalization era, at least economically, seems to be largely over. The coronavirus has exposed all the weaknesses of having these deeply extended supply chains that are super risky in terms of how you can sustain them in terms of the kind of fracas that we're going into right now with the pandemic, but also in general the threat of war. These are not long-term decision makers at hand.
But they don't have to be. If you're running a company, it's not going to be necessarily long-term. They are looking for ways of being profitable. And in their minds, this is a way of being profitable. They don't care about the whole, what's going to take place in 20 years. They care about their bottom line at this moment. I mean, that's the way it operates. That's the way it's always operated.
Yeah, but here's the thing. You can do that in the short term, but if it doesn't work in the long term, then it doesn't make sense either. I wouldn't call that rational. You're saying that's rational. I'm saying by definition, that's not.
That's a rational choice because their job is philosophically to make as much profit as possible. You're saying it's irrational in the long run. I agree with you that it's irrational in the long run. That's why the system always crashes.
It's even irrational for them in the long run. That's the point that I'm making. It is even irrational for them in the long run.
Oh, I agree.
If it's irrational for them in the long run, then again, they're operating within this system of incentives. And here's the thing.
Yes.
Socialism was embedded within capitalism from the 40s on. Socialism in the United States and capitalism were tied hand in hand since at the latest FDR, but arguably quite a bit earlier. We were pursuing these things in tandem. What really messed us up, as far as I can tell, was this decision that we made in the mid-40s, and we really escalated into in the early 70s, to continue overextending ourselves. And that meant that at home, the people that we would expect to make these rational decisions, people we would expect to be purely driven by greed, actually weren't. They were making short-sighted decisions. They were operating within their own corrupt system of incentives. Now, I don't want to wholeheartedly defend capitalism because at the same time, I was just arguing for socialism too. We need more of both of these things. That's my take.
I guess I just don't understand the first part. I don't think you've made your case well for the first part. I mean, you try to pin this on imperialism, but it was an imperialistic decision for them to put investment into China, which is basically what companies in the United States did. They knew that they can make a buck off of it. I mean, in their heads, globalization was the way forward. That was the way things were going to be. And they made the rational choice that we need to lower profits. If McDonald's today can put in a machine or a computer that will make a hamburger for a nickel cheaper than it would be to pay a worker, they will put in that machine to make that hamburger that's a nickel cheaper. Now, from a larger perspective, meaning a larger rational perspective, you can look at that and say, well, wait a minute, that worker is no longer going to have any money to buy your product. So you are basically stabbing yourself in the kidney in the process of you making that profit. Yes, you're right, Shane. I agree with you long term, but that's not the way they think. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. That it is a rational choice from the context of a company to try to expand and maximize their profit. Labor is one of the things that is expensive. And so if you can get that labor at a cheaper price, it is infinitely rational to pay off your congressmen, to give them all sorts of cash and everything else for them to get rid of tariffs so you can import that stuff into the country without a charge. That's your system at work. Those are the system of incentives that just work that way. I mean, that's a capitalism thing. That's not an imperialistic thing. I mean, would you agree with that?
No, because here's the thing. Again, they were operating under a different system of incentives before the Second World War. That system of incentives changed, and the context of those changes was what we might call socialism. It was the political economy of the United States that changed the tariffs, that changed this stuff. Capitalism is always bounded by the incentives of whatever governmental systems it's operating within. And that's what changed. The imperialism is what changed that. Again,
no, it's not. That's not true.
If before the 30s,
the whole point of it is profit. Regardless of the system that it's in, the goal of it is profit.
Yeah, but again, that's why we give incentives that constrict what's profitable, that does that in a way that's best for people in general. That's why, again, as far as I can tell, every nation around the world has adopted capitalist principles to varying degrees, yes. Whether it's a free market, whatever the case may be.
But I guess I'm trying to pin you down on this very specific point to understand that it is still, the entire point was profit, and that as a system expanded and developed, you had people who were within that system who wanted to get more profit, in which case they would work and give money to political actors to undo some of the laws and legislation that constrain that, especially after the New Deal. I mean, why do you think people are calling for a New Deal?
Well, I mean, but you're talking past me. And we might be talking past each other. I don't want to put it all on you.
I mean, I'm being very specific to kind of point out that our system itself is operating in a particular way. I mean, my argument is basically reality, that objectively speaking, this is what has taken place. And it's not conceptual, it's in fact. We're got to go to a break. I'm sorry. We're back. God, this is a great argument. All right, so we're going to be back in a moment. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Join us. We have this awesome conversation. This conversation is going to continue at some point. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, disembodied but ever present. We're coming to you live from the station out of DC. Now, if you guys are in the area and you want to catch up on us through the radio, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down and you're digging these back and forths that Shane and I have, these great fault line arguments, whatever the platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like, give us a share. You can also join in this conversation by sending out a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. And yes, Tarif, we know you're there. I apologize, but we will get to you. But joining us right now is Miko Peld, human rights activist and author of The General's Son, Journey of Israel into Palestine, and Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Miko, welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning.
So let me ask you this. Can you give us an update on what is taking place from the standpoint of the Israeli annexation? I mean, basically, it seems like many of the countries are against it, whether or not they'll actively do anything about it. They do seem to be belly aching about it. But can you give us an update up to this point about what is taking place in regards to that particular policy that has caused so much consternation around the world and that I find to be just grossly immoral?
Well, anyone who's paying attention knows that every so often the world wakes up and decides to condemn Israel or decides to protest this action or that action that Israel takes against the Palestinians. And then a week or two go by and everybody goes back to sleep and Israel does whatever it wants to do, what it was planning to do. And this is no different than that. I mean, Israel has already annexed some more than 30 years ago, East Jerusalem. 20 years before that, it annexed all of West Jerusalem. So it basically annexed illegally all of the city of Jerusalem. It annexed the Golan, the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria. And it has annexed parts of Palestine over the last 70 years constantly, with millions of Palestinians living either in squalor and refugee camps as a result of that, or with no rights, being killed, detained, and so forth. So now Israel wants to gradually, and Israel doesn't call it annexation, by the way. Israel calls it sovereignty. So it is basically, extending its sovereignty onto these areas. And there's a whole area of the West Bank, which borders with the Jordan River. So it's the whole eastern part of the West Bank. And it was expected that would be the next part of Palestine that Israel annexed, or the next part where it applies its sovereignty, because it's, relatively speaking, sparsely populated by Palestinians. The land is fertile. There's access to the Jordan River water, and it connects a whole bunch of settlements. And the problem with the settlements, until Israeli sovereignty is applied to them, they feel like the unwanted sibling, so to speak. You know what I mean? They every time they want to build, they have to get a government approval. They need special permits for things. They're not just like any other town or city in the rest of Israel. So this will allow them basically, if they want to build, if they want to expand, if they want to take more Palestinian land, they don't need government approval. It becomes a local issue, like a local council issue. And so this is why they want it. Now, Israel saw that by making a big announcement, it's creating a great deal of, consternation, and people are condemning. So what they normally do is they just delayed the actual announcement, but they're actually going ahead on the ground with the annexation. In other words, settlers are taking over Palestinian land already. They're doing exactly what they planned to do. The Palestinians who are living in the area understand that they no longer answer to the Palestinian Authority, but to the Israeli authorities. So it just decided to delay the announcement, but on the ground, Palestinians are already feeling the brunt of this.
Wow. I was in Israel, I think it was back in 2008, and took my wife with me. I think it was a couple of years ago. When I was there, I was on a bus. The bus driver was stopped. The person who stopped him was very polite to me. However, they pulled the bus driver out, made everybody basically wait because the driver apparently didn't have some kind of permit that he needed. He's Palestinian. Also, going through lines, you kind of made mention to the difficulty of it, to just get from point A to point B and do any kind of business there, especially if you're Palestinian, with all of the checkpoints and everything else that take place, meaning you're just basically squeezing this open-air ghetto in a country that they appropriated. The other countries that don't particularly like this, who are bellyaching about this, and for the longest time, the annexation was even technically against our own policies. Do any other countries have leverage on this? Like you said, they've basically gone along with it. But this is clearly a land grab. It's recognized as such from around the world as a land grab, that they're stealing land. And yet, is there any influence by any other country on their actions?
Well, I think we would do well to realize we're not talking about a regular, legitimate state that is doing something wrong, that is doing something that should be condemned. We are talking about an illegal, illegitimate apartheid regime that has taken over Palestine and has been destroying it and destroying its people for more than 70 years now. So that's the state of Israel. Now, what you described is true. This is the experience of Palestinians everywhere. They have to go through checkpoints. They cannot travel freely. They cannot see their families. If their families live beyond a certain line, they can't go and cultivate their land. If their land is beyond a certain line, they can't go to school. They can't, their lives are disrupted all the time. And I'm talking about Palestinians throughout the entire Palestine, not just the West Bank. I'm talking about Palestinians everywhere. So that's the reality. Now, leverage is something that you choose to either use or not. Everybody has leverage. The question is, do you want to use it? The United States gives Israel almost $4 billion every year. That's a lot of money, so that's a lot of leverage. The question is, do they want to use the leverage? We know that there's some movement in Congress right now, a petition to somehow leverage that and to get Israel to postpone or to delay or to not go ahead with this annexation. It's not going to work because the United States does not want to use this leverage. And the Europeans do not want to use their leverage. They give Israel, they do a lot of commerce. In fact, the EU is Israel's biggest commercial trade partner. But nobody wants to use their leverage. Nobody wants to do anything. It's not a question of whether they have it or not. It's a question of whether they want to use it or not. And the answer is no. The Europeans, the Americans do not care about the Palestinians. They do not care about Palestinians' lives. We talk about lives that matter or don't matter. We know the black lives in America do not matter, obviously. I mean, the facts are very plain. They don't matter to white people. They don't matter to the establishment. And Palestinian lives don't matter to anyone either. Palestinians are being killed on a daily basis. They're denied water. They're denied the ability to travel. They're denied their rights. I mean, think about it. Denying people water, where there's plenty of water, but saying, no, the water's going to stop at this line and these people are not going to get water. Denying people access to healthcare, access to medical care when they need it, particularly after they've been bombed and there's thousands and thousands of injured, and denying them that. So that's how Palestinians are being treated and have been treated for a very long time. So again, this is not something new. This particular annexation is just a new headline. It's not a new issue. It's not a new it's not a new idea. And by the way, just a few days ago, Israel announced that it's building a massive military intelligence base in the Negev Desert. The Negev is the southern 50% of Palestine is called the Negev. It's a very fertile desert, so that's why they've been kicking out the Palestinians. And you've got hundreds of Palestinians living in squalor, living in townships, while Israeli towns all around have a very high standard of living, particularly over there. and it's all been annexed. And these particular Palestinians even have Israeli citizenship, and even that doesn't help them because they're all being kicked out, their lands are being grabbed, their towns are being destroyed, their homes are being demolished. And this time it's not for an Israeli settlement, it's for a military base. So this is an ongoing saga. This is an ongoing story. And as soon as the world decides to use its leverage, or I should say, as soon as people around the world act and demand sanctions and demand that the countries in which they live apply sanctions and apply their leverage, this will stop.
Hey, Miko, this is Shane here. I actually had a question. Boris Johnson has been pushing back. I can't tell what the significance of this is going to be, but again, UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote a letter within the last few weeks, and then today I hear he's pushing back against plans for annexation. Do you know what that's going to mean in terms of this process?
Nothing whatsoever. He's not going to apply any real pressure. It's a polite letter saying, we love you so much, but we really think this would be the wrong thing to do. And this will, only create problems and blah. It's nothing. It's absolutely meaningless. It's not going to change anything. He's not going to actually stand up and say, we will stop selling arms to Israel, which the UK does. We are going to impose sanctions on the state of Israel if it does such and such. He's not going to say that. It's just a polite letter saying, we love you, we respect you, but please don't do this because it makes us look bad. That's basically what this is.
And so do you see this as basically just providing cover, just sort of trying to keep up an appearance of acting under good graces or whatever, and that's all he's doing there?
Yeah, that's all this is. That's all the Europeans do ever when it comes to Israel. They might pass a resolution. They might have a few protests. There might be a few, I think the Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs almost lost his job because a few weeks ago, because he dared to say that this annexation was illegal. And he said this as part of, there were several European ministers who said this, and he was threatened with losing his job if he didn't take it back. I mean, the Europeans are just as complicit in this as the Americans are. And then once they do pass a resolution or write a letter like Johnson did, they immediately follow up with either visits to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem or invitations to the Israeli Prime Minister, and going on and on about how much they love and respect and support Israel. This is all lip service. This will have absolutely no consequences. The only thing that would work is when the constituents, the people, what is called the constituency of conscience, will stand up and demand that the government impose sanctions. We need to demand that the Sixth Fleet go in and impose a no-fly zone over Gaza and start helping the people in Gaza with their medical needs, with rebuilding, with humanitarian aid and so forth. I mean, this is the only thing that's going to change this.
We have about 2 minutes for this answer for this, so before we have to go to a break. But what is the internal politics in Israel right now? Is there any kind of movement internally against this? I mean, this is kind of one of those things that Shane was mentioned to early on, that you can have a short-term rationale for a particular policy that has long-term consequences that are not necessarily the greatest. Considering the amount of pushback that this is getting, and even from the standpoint of lefties either in the United States or lefties abroad that absolutely hate this, would be against this, and even if they were in power, they would actually try to put through policy with this. Is there any internal political discussion that this may not necessarily be in the best interest of Israel from the standpoint of enemies? Or for that matter, is there any internal discussion regarding pushback as any kind of movement in Israel to be against this kind of policy? Or is that just basically put down by the prevailing point of view of the nation?
Well, I mean, the government that's in place right now was voted for by the people, by a large majority of the people. They represent the will of the voters. And the voters knew that this was coming, and they voted and they elected these people. Now, there's always some debate, but the debate is usually either around the margin, where you do have people who are far enough on the left where they realize Israel is consistently committing crimes against humanity, and they speak up, but they're marginal. And then you've got a few others that say, well, this is really bad timing. This is making us look bad. Let's wait. Let's postpone. But by and large, the voters spoke, and they said they want this guy or this particular government to execute these particular policies, and that's why they voted for them. So the discussion is marginal. By and large, people support this and want this.
The government.
That is the voice of Miko Peled. We're going to go into a break right now. When we come back, we're going to be continuing to talk about this issue. Also have some questions. I've seen Miko doing some seminars or webinars about Israeli influence in the American education system. So I'm just curious to hear about that. But regardless, we'll be back with Miko in just a minute. He is a human rights activist and author. Learn more about him on the other side. Right now, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Miko Peled. Miko is an author. He's also a human rights activist. As an author, he's written the books The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, as well as Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. For folks who want to read his writing, you can check him out, mikopeled.com. That's MIKOPELED.com. You can also follow him on Twitter, just his first and last name spelled the same way, MIKOPELED. Miko, thank you again for being with us. I actually had a quick follow-up question. So we were talking about Boris Johnson. You saw that as just a broadly weak symbolic move. I also see a sort of loose coalition in the form of Egypt, Jordan, France, and Germany, who've said they won't approve any official changes to the state lines of Israel since they've been declared since 1967. Do you see that as being any more significant than the UK's pushback, or do you see that as another sort of weak symbolic move? What's your take?
Well, the only state that really expressed in no uncertain terms that it opposes the Trump plan and it will have to take serious measures regarding if Israel goes ahead with the annexation is Jordan. King Abdullah of Jordan said very early on that he absolutely opposes and stood against. In fact, I think he was the first of very few, actually, leaders who spoke out against the Trump plan. And he said very clearly this will lead to serious consequences in terms of the relations between Israel and Jordan, to the point where he even said he might have to downgrade the diplomatic mission in Amman, which I think is the right thing to do. I wouldn't expect anything from anybody else. The Egyptian regime is the current Egyptian regime was put in place by Israel and the United States. They're not going to do anything that Israel and the United States don't want. And like I said earlier, the Europeans are not going to use any leverage. They're not going to impose sanctions. Perhaps one parliament here, one parliament there will condemn it, but certainly not the big countries, not France, not Germany, not the UK, are not going to act at this point. That's absolutely clear.
I'm always fascinated by the relationship that the United States and Israel has. I mean, when I went there, they were like, I remember one guy said, our countries are allies. Just in the course of going about my affairs in the country, or there was this other odd phenomena of everyone wanted to have this conversation, this kind of argument of sorts. I know in this country, as an American, as an African American, there's a weird alienation sometimes in that takes place in regards to operating the country that way. But there's also this notion that whoever you are, whatever you are, there's an external point of view that you are aware of, and that some degree gets appropriated into your own point of view in the way that you operate in the world. This seemed to be one of the situations that also took place in Israel, meaning regardless of me just being a man, any perspective of me in America is going to come within the context with all sorts of labels associated with it, some of which I push back on, some of which I accept, even for myself, even if those things may be against me implicitly. Israel, is it not the same way? When the Israelis were outside of the country, oftentimes you'd get into these back and forths in regards to the legitimacy of the state or whether or not the rationale of the state is correct. Have you seen this as being one of the things in talking to people or Israelis when they're having conversations out of the country where there is somewhat an acknowledgement that the other countries consider what they're doing to be abhorrent, and as such, they get somewhat defensive in regards to defending that particular point of view? Have you seen that type of intellectual introspection in regards to maybe not necessarily the state, but definitely individual people who are coming out of the country that still may be in alignment with Israel itself?
I would call it intellectual introspection. I would call it being defensive when you know that you're absolutely on the wrong side of every moral issue that is possible. Look, this is not random. Israel invests a lot in making sure that Israelis who go abroad represent, and I say the word represent, in quotation marks, the state properly. So I'll give you two examples. I was sitting at Tel Aviv airport, and just looking around, sitting bored, and I found a little flyer that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs offers to Israeli traveling overseas, and making sure that they know what answers to give when people approach them and people argue with them about all the wrongs that Israel is committing. Furthermore, Israel has when students go overseas to do all kinds of, talk about high school kids doing student exchange programs in different countries, they actually have to go through a course, an online course that prepares them for this. And so I heard about the course, so I signed up for it and I took it myself. And it is a course that is so incredibly offensive. It is so incredibly it's so full of demagoguery. It is so full of lies. It is so full of it's everything they could possibly wrong, and they do it in a very, very, very friendly and sweet way. So, for example, you've heard of the BDS movement, the movement that's called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel.
Yes, yeah.
And this is a Palestinian cause, the Palestinian movement, led by Palestinians, initiated by Palestinians, and has very clear demands that Israel end its military occupation of parts of Palestine that are still military occupied, offer equal rights to Palestinians so they have the same rights as I do as an Israeli citizen, and allow the refugees to return. Fine. Very clear, very, very, there's no vagueness about what the BDS is about. In this online course, you have some government official explaining to these kids what is BDS. And the way they explain BDS is that it is what they call a red and green alliance. Red and green alliance means red representing radical anarchist communist Jew haters, and green representing jihadi, crazy, fanatic Muslim Jew haters who create an alliance in order to destroy Israel and kill Jews. That's what BDS is. It has nothing to do with anything that Israel has ever done wrong. There's no legitimacy to it. There's nothing to it that anybody should possibly support because it's one big anti-Semitic plot. This is what is being taught to high school kids as they go overseas so that they will have the tools, so to speak, to argue the case for Israel. Israel invests a lot in making sure that Israeli citizens, when they go out there, and they do go out there, Israelis travel overseas a lot, and know how to represent and give the right answers to all of these questions. And like I said, they invest a lot, millions of dollars and manpower and hours of thinking and planning and strategizing so that when Israelis are out there, they can represent the state well. And it's terrible because this is the kind of one-sided reactionary indoctrination that you only find in countries that are neo-fascist like Israel, which is what Israel is. It's horrifying, but they invest a great deal in it. It's not random. When you see these arguments, when you see these people talking about Israel, Israelis who are overseas and talk about Israel, it is not random. They've been indoctrinated and they've been told what to say.
Hey, Mika, we only have a few minutes left. We might have time for another question after this one. I just want to get this in real quick, though. I saw you posting about this. You've been hosting these webinars on Israel's influence on the American educational system. I know nothing about this. Can you briefly explain what you guys have been talking about? What's going on there?
Well, I'm glad you bring it up. And if anyone wants to see it, if you go to mikopillar.com, it's on YouTube and it's got the recordings and everything. We did 2 panels with experts that talked about how the pro-Israeli groups, Zionist groups like the Anti-Defamation League and others invest millions of dollars into editing social studies books in American public schools to make sure that the way the history is described, the way the current reality is described, is favorable to Israel. It's very similar to what I just said about how they indoctrinate their own people. And you would be shocked at the kind of things that come up, the kind of meticulous editing that goes on. Now they have these, one of the biggest conferences the teachers have is the social studies conference. It's an annual conference. And all the social studies teachers go there and they get curriculum and they get training. And these guys offer the teachers continuing education units, CUs, that they get paid for to take, which has never happened, where they actually teach them and give them this material so that then later on the teachers can apply it when they teach about the Middle East. It is horrifying. It is full of Islamophobia. It is full of anti-Arab indoctrination, and it glorifies and glamorizes Israel. Now, there are several groups within the country. In Virginia, there's the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights. There's a Coalition for Human Rights in Texas. And there are individuals and other non-governmental agencies that have picked up on this and are now fighting this and working to change this. And we spoke to, several of these people, the National Arab American Women's Association and others, and then individual teachers and educators and administrators who have noticed this, who have suffered from this, and have tried to take action. But of course, the other side is well-funded and has been doing this for a very long time. So it's a tough fight to battle. They've had some successes in kind of redefining things and standing up against this assault. But it is an incredibly effective assault to make sure that American students in studying social studies in high school and in middle school end up learning that Islam is bad, Arabs are terrorists, anything that has to do with Palestine or Palestinians is terrorism, and that Israel is always right, and Israel is our best ally and our best friend. It is absolutely horrifying. So I really recommend people go to mikopeled.com and check out these conversations. I knew some of this was going on, but I had no idea just how well planned, how thorough, and how invasive this is. And, the title we gave this was, "What are they teaching our children?" And that is a scary, scary thought.
Miko, we only have about a minute left, but I just want to follow up on that. We'd love to get guests on this topic later. Again, this is nothing I know about, but this sounds important enough for us to definitely cover. Real quick, though, how long has this been going on?
Decades. This has been going on for decades. I can't tell you an actual date, but this has been going on for decades. They have planned this and they've been working on this. I know, the first I heard of it, my kids all, my older kids graduated from high school. Graduated college already, and they're out in the world in their mid-20s. And I remember when they were in middle school and high school, and I was looking through their books just out of interest, and I was horrified to see what they were learning. So this has been going on for decades.
That's sad and that's interesting. Yeah, we'd love to learn more about this. Just talk to one of my producers, one of our producers.
Contact later on, I'm happy to give you the people's names. Of course, this is incredibly important. People do not know just how invasive this is. We think that there's an Israeli lobby. They lobby politicians. They get their way. By the time they get to that point, it's far gone. It starts locally. It starts in local schools. It starts with local school boards. Their influence. Or I should say, it's not just influence, it's really an invasion, is very dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
That's the voice of Miko Peled. Miko, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Hopefully we can have you back on soon. Again, Miko Peled is a human rights activist. He's also an author. Specifically, he's the author of the books, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. If you want to learn more about what we were just talking about, including the bit about education there, you can go to his website, mikopeled.com. That's spelled MIKOPELED.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at MIKOPELED, just Miko Peled. We have another great 2 hours coming up. This next hour, I'll be talking with Alex Craner, then Margaret Kimberly. Then at 9:30, we're going to have a new guest on, Eleanor Goldfield, to talk about West Virginian strip mining. Regardless, though, we'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to the voices of Shane Stranahan and Jamarl Thomas. My great co-host will be back in just a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Welcome to the divided states of America. This is your daily inoculation for propaganda. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with Shane Stranahan. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody in a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the independent blimp about to crash land into some random ocean, I am your investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
That's a horrible sight. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, that's a horrible sight, Shane. I hope you're better.
Well, here's the thing. I love air travel. I love the idea of blimps, even though it's kind of, I don't know, Art Deco or something like that. There's something weirdly tyrannical about it. But blimps are just so cool. But then I just think, what's the worst that could go wrong? And I just think crashing. And anyway, don't want to throw that nightmare out.
But fair enough. But let's get to some headlines. So the Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that the state's faithless elector laws, which allow states to remove or fine electoral college delegates who don't vote for the presidential candidate who they were pledged to support, are constitutional. The UK has passed a raft of new sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against 49 Russian officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. Just over half of those officials are in Russia, where they targeted 25 individuals they associate with the death in prison of Russian tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky. Most notably, Russia's top prosecutor, Alexander Baskin. In Saudi Arabia, they targeted 6 former and current officials they tied to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. In Myanmar, the most notable target was Min Aung Hlaing, the current commander of Myanmar's armed forces, and in North Korea, the only target was Kim Jong-ho, an official who they said was in charge of the country's prison system. What about sanctions for ours? We have 25% of the world's prison population in our jails. The UN is warning that the novel coronavirus pandemic is causing serious disruption to HIV treatment in many parts of the world, with shipments of medical supplies disrupted by broken supply chains. California is delaying the state assembly's return to work after Democrat Autumn Burke of Marina del Rey and 4 others who worked in the building tested positive for coronavirus. In Georgia, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Bottoms has tested positive for COVID-19, although she says she has no symptoms. Now, she's seen as a possible candidate for Joe Biden's vice presidential pick. In sports news, in football, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes signed the most lucrative contract extension in history. In baseball, the Nationals and the Astros, the 2 teams in last year's World Series, have each canceled training camp workouts today due to delays in COVID testing results. Stock markets in Asia ended lower yesterday. Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 dropped 0.4%. South Korea's Kospi lost early gains to decline nearly 1%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng dropped 0.7%, while Shanghai Composite gained 1.2%. TikTok has joined a list of social media platforms withdrawing from Hong Kong, along with Facebook, Google, and Twitter, over worries that they will be held culpable for individuals identified by the government as dissidents. Wow. A judge on Monday ordered that the Dakota Access Pipeline shut down for additional environmental review was more than 3 years after it began pumping oil, handing a victory to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and delivering a blow to President Donald Trump's efforts to weaken public health and environmental protections his administration views as obstacles to business. Those are your headlines, and this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So the one I want to talk about is Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, this is a big deal to me. I've said before, my grandfather was quarter Cherokee. And even though he didn't necessarily do tribe stuff, it was very, very clear that this was a part of our history, even though we didn't necessarily honor it. We always just saw ourselves as African Americans. As I got older, this became more pressing. One of the things that really brought this to limelight was Standing Rock. It was basically, this was in 2016, 2017, where there was a large a protest movement around the notion of protecting their water. You had Native Americans praying while being hit, beat, doused with freezing water in freezing temperatures, being blown to bits with weapons, where they would supposedly non-lethal weapons, in one case blowing somebody's arm off. It was indiscriminate violence against people who were peaceful and protecting their land. Now, the catch here and the rub and the issue became they had a pipeline, Energy Transfer Partnership had a pipeline that they were initially going to put through Dakota, the city in Dakota. Now, that city's primary population was white. They did not want that there, so they just dumped it into the area of Standing Rock, basically under this tribe's water supply. Now, the tribe understood that, wait a minute, you moved it from a place where you're going to put it before because that particular community complained about it, but you dumped it into our spot. How much indignities do we need to bear? And if this thing leaks, it's going to contaminate our water. Now, Obama, during Thanksgiving, while indigenous people were getting shot, beat, kicked, sprayed, arrested, all sorts of violence commissioned by the state in protection of this particular company and that particular oil, Obama was cutting a turkey on Thanksgiving in some kind of representation of indigenous folks, while real indigenous people were being beaten and abused a few 100 miles away. Now, the resolution to this, to some degree, came when Obama was like, I'm just going to let this play out, where you had veterans who said, we're going to go to Standing Rock and we're going to get beat by cops. That's what we're going to do. We're going to put our bodies on the line and make them beat and injure us, people who serve this country. And Obama, in finding that out, immediately, okay, we're going to do this environmental review. Now, when Trump gets in office, Trump rips the environmental review away almost immediately. Now, the catch here is that's illegal. The environmental review is a legal process that has to take a certain amount of time in order to take a certain amount of it. Trump got rid of it. This judge basically said that that was wrong, that you can't just get rid of that, and that there needs to be a real legitimate environmental review of this particular area, and the oil that is in that pipeline needs to be taken out. Now, this is considered a win for the Standing Rock tribe. I also consider this a win for the Standing Rock tribe. But this was one of the worst scenarios of Democrats' malfeasance. If you remember, Elizabeth Warren, who donned the moniker of a Native American for the majority of her life, or at the very least, the up-teen years of her life, reverting back to white after she got her tenure. I mean, this was on her license, Texas bar license, had nothing to say about it. Nothing. She was mum. None of them said anything until Obama finally did something, at which point all of them had something big to say. Tulsi Gabbard went there. Bernie Sanders, at the very least, brought it up. But many of these other politicians didn't say squat. This was a horrendous betrayal. And not just a betrayal, I would say the Native American population in this country at this point is probably used to this level of vagary. But it was horrible to watch in real time as this was taking place. So Shane, I do consider this a win. I consider this a big deal. My wife and I were watching this. I remember she cried when she realized that they were basically injuring and beating these people, and there was not going to necessarily be a recourse. So to me, I listen to this news with it feels good because I do consider it to some degree a win, and these wins are few and far between. So yeah, were you aware of this story? Like, were you paying attention to this back in 2016, 2017?
I was paying attention to this, and partly because I'd been doing work with my dad down in South Dakota. We were doing a bunch of investigations of the Republican-led state, a bunch of corruption there. That's right. I was aware of what was going on, but I never went up to North Dakota. I never personally experienced any of this stuff, so I'm peripherally aware of it. One thing I'll note on the sort of present state of things with this order, oil prices are pretty low. Yeah. So there's this sort of other dimension we might add in here, which is this probably isn't going. I'm sure it's going to impact the company that's invested in this stuff, all that stuff. But this is also, I think you get what I'm saying. This isn't going to be
this is not something that's necessarily needed, and yet we were going to take the opportunity to pretty much basically all pipelines leak and we're putting it under their water. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If we don't need this, why are we trying to force this?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there's this other argument, and this is a real complicated argument having to do with oil and energy and all this stuff. For somebody who sees the damage that rampant CO2 emissions have done to our environment, and seem to likely to be able to continue to do to our environment for a long time. The other side of this is with fracking in the United States, we've also, this is the weird thing, the petrodollar. If we have more oil produced in the U.S., we're less dependent on Saudi exports of oil. We're less dependent on them artificially propping our economy up. It weakens that tie. And so that's the only ambiguity, the only sort of moral ambiguity here, which is, if we have more energy independence here, whatever that energy, whatever the source of that energy, that's going to help us to deal with that relationship, which has been historically problematic.
Just one catch, though. This oil is being piped outside of the country. I mean, most of this oil is just being shipped for sale elsewhere.
Yeah, we're a net energy producer, and we have been for a while. That's the thing, and I'm throwing that in there just to get sort of everything on the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But you're right. It allows a certain degree of separation from Saudi Arabia in regards to oil finding that we were producing this much oil.
Yeah, and with Standing Rock, specifically with the pipeline, we were having this argument earlier about capitalism and socialism, this back and forth. This does seem like one of those clear examples of capitalism gone wrong. There should have been protections in place. These are some of the people who would be most endangered by this. Again, you shouldn't be messing with your water supply, just on this very foundational level. In the same way that people get worried about nuclear proliferation and these atmospheric threats, if we had more nuclear payloads dropped, what that would do to radiation around the world, all this stuff. There's also just this basic issue of what do we do with our water? The water pollution is a longstanding issue. We'll be talking about that a little bit later, I'm sure, with Eleanor Gold about West Virginia hilltop mining. That has huge seepage problems. Again, decades old thing. We'll learn more about it later. That's a big deal. And again, if you're a government who's thinking about what's best, not just for the people who live in your society, but sort of the long term as a state, as a government, you'd think that you would have enough foresight to be able to prepare for these kinds of things, to prevent this from being a serious threat. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that's what happened. Just looking, again, I'd like to learn more about this, but it seems like back in 2016, people were warning about this, about the threat of a spillage. Pretty soon after it was built, I heard that there was a spillage.
It was.
With sort of unknown consequences. So yeah, this is definitely a case of a failure of unbridled capitalism, whatever that looks like. Although again, I don't mean to tie us back down into this debate, but we don't have time for it, frankly. We've got Alex Craner coming on next, but there's also this perspective. There is also the United States has its own economic interests, like with the Saudi relationship, in becoming a net energy exporter. And so it seemed to me like you were saying Obama was feasting on a turkey, which is a pretty ignoble image to have in your mind while this stuff was going on a couple hundred miles away. Yeah. They were tied at the waist. They were tied into this thing together. So again, I think we shouldn't get into the capitalism socialism thing. We've got Alex Craner coming on next. Any quick response there? Anything you want to say before we go into the break?
I agree with you, I don't want to delve too far back into the argument. So fair enough. But yeah, we are a net producer. I would say this though: the moment that we come to our conclusions about whether or not this has an actual impact on the environment, meaning if we say that oil and gas has an impact, and which it does. I mean, the same thing with animal agriculture. They're like the other half of the equation in regards to the waste materials of carbon. If we say that, and we recognize that this is not necessarily something we want to do in a sustainable way going into the future, well, maybe we need to take action to deal with that. And we have other means of energy production that we can focus on as opposed to doing stuff like this. So I agree.
All right. You know what? I think we should close this out. We've got Alex Craner on the line. We'll come back around to talk with him about this new this new raft of sanctions coming out of the UK with the Magnitsky Act. Be talking with him more about this in just a minute. For now, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. If you're in the D.C. area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can listen to us 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, also, as well as 1140 AM. If you want to catch us online, we're on Periscope right now. You can check us out on Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. Nothing fancy, just those words. On YouTube, you can also search for us, Fault Lines Radio. You can also search for Jamarl Thomas. We have these 2 simulcasted streams going up, although to Jamarl's benefit, you can see his face. You can also see my face. His face is moving. My face is not. And it's a bit out of date, but regardless, you can also, if you're online, catch us Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or what am I getting wrong there? I usually just iHeartRadio. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
And Apple Music. Yeah, you shouldn't doubt yourself unless you're actually wrong. I wasn't. Anyway, with all that out of the way, we're joined now by Alex Craner. Second time we've had him on in the last couple of weeks, and glad to have him back. Some things he said have spurred conversations we've had since then. We're talking about he put forward this endogenous growth model as compared to imperialism, these 2 contrasting modes. I've come back to that a few times, so I just wanted to call that back. That's not going to be what we're talking about today, though. We're talking instead about the UK's new Magnitsky sanctions. These have come out in the last day. Alex is the author of the Grand The Naked Hedgie. That's thenakedhedgie.com. TheNakedHedgie.com. The Naked Hedgie. You can also follow him on Twitter, Naked Hedgie. Just Naked Hedgie. Again, that's NakedHedgie. All right, Alex, I hope you're not naked this morning. That's too much for any of us to handle. How are you doing, though?
Good morning. I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, we can do without the visual of me naked.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So yeah, we're talking. We actually, the second headline we were reading off this morning was about this new slate of sanctions. Again, these are sanctions against individuals, not states. They're coming under the auspices, or under the aegis, I guess, of the Magnitsky Act. That's the act that's permitting these individual sanctions. And specifically, there are 49 individuals who were targeted, most of them in Russia, 25 individuals in Russia, associated with the death in prison of Russian tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky. At least that's what they're saying. They also called him lawyer. He's not a lawyer. He was a tax advisor. That's maybe a triviality to some, but that was key in terms of how the story was painted. Most notable among the people targeted by these new sanctions are Russia's top prosecutor. This is not a lowly prosecutor. Russia's top prosecutor, Alexander Bastrikin. There were also other countries targeted, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. Maybe we can talk about those too, but help me to sort of figure this out. What was going on here? What's the significance of this? And what should we know that I didn't just say?
So just to give you a little bit of background, that should go far to explain why many of the Western jurisdictions, particularly large financial centers, like to use Magnitsky sanctions, and why they use the cloak of human rights. Basically, here's what happened during the 1990s in Russia. Russia transitioned from communism to capitalism, quote unquote. And during this transition period, which lasted mostly through the 1990s, hundreds and thousands of Western advisors flocked to Russia surrounded the government of Boris Yeltsin and gave them advice about how to transition their economy from communism to capitalism. What happened in practice is that by following this advice, basically Russia turned over their real national wealth. The estimate is between $200 billion and $600 billion, which used to be a lot of money. And a lot of this wealth vanished through Western financial centers, offshore or to places like New York, London, Switzerland, Amsterdam, and so forth. With Vladimir Putin's coming to power, there has been an effort that continues to try to recuperate the family silverware. And in order to do that, Russians have investigated these transfers of wealth, of stock ownership, of bonds, of gold, of various other forms of wealth. And what happens when you do such investigations, or when you file lawsuits in places like the United States, like in New York, in London, in Geneva, in Zurich, you trigger a process that is very difficult then to control, and basically high-powered, very capable, intelligent lawyers will depose people who participated in this process, witnesses. They can file freedom of information requests to release documents and so forth. So much information will come out into the light of day and on record, and it will be forever impossible to deny. It will become forever part of the record. So in order to frustrate this process, and this is my theory, but I'll tell you who confirmed this theory for me. It was none other than Secretary of State Pompeo. I'll get to that in a moment. Basically, with legal abominations like Magnitsky Act, you get to frustrate this process by simply taking the individuals who might act as witnesses, who might act as investigators, who might come to provide documentary information. You declare that they are human rights abusers, and you sanction them. You freeze their assets. You make it impossible for them to travel to London, to New York, wherever they would be, wherever they would be giving testimony, and you frustrate the whole process so that nothing happens. It's a way to cover up a theft. Now, you couldn't go to a legislature and to say, like, we stole 600 billion of Russia's wealth, and now we want to cover it up. So obviously you're going to go for some kind of a human rights justification. This is what, we do best in the West. We love human rights. So basically, that is the main justification that is the main real reason why acts of Congress like the Magnitsky Act are put in place and made law. An amazing thing about the Magnitsky Act is that, uniquely in the Western judicial tradition, it does not require any due process. So basically, if some unnamed bureaucrat from the United States Treasury Department decides that Alex Krainer is a human rights abuser under whatever stretched justification, they can put me on the Magnitsky sanctions list, and I have no recourse. So I will no longer be able to travel to the United States. If I have any U.S. dollar-denominated assets or anything in the U.S. banks, it could be frozen and taken away from me, and I wouldn't have any recourse. Now, while for all polite society purposes, this is justified as a law to protect human rights and to force naughty governments to respect the human rights. The reality is that this is a firewall for governments like Russia to use Western jurisdictions to seek redress for the grand larceny that occurred in Russia during the 1980s. And we already saw that, for example, former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, has done this when the Trump administration sought to investigate corruption in Ukraine. Marie Yovanovitch frustrated it by refusing to issue U.S. visas to Ukrainians who could testify and provide information to the investigators. But last year, it was Secretary Pompeo who literally said that this was a different case. So this was the case of United States imposing visa restrictions on the investigators of the International Criminal Court. So Pompeo literally said that these visa restrictions, I'm reading his statement verbatim, these visa restrictions may be used to deter ICC efforts to pursue allied personnel, including Israelis, without allies' consent. So, we can see that from the logic of the logic of empire dictates that you use these kinds of mechanism to frustrate any kind of investigation into the misdeeds of the empire. Human rights are a cloak, it's a smokescreen. It's disingenuous, particularly, like for Western jurisdiction to have people like Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange in solitary confinement with no charges against them. So if anybody genuinely cared about human rights, they could make a change closer to home and do some real difference with it.
I got a question for you. Thank you for joining us, by the way. You mentioned back in the 80s where the United States had the shock capitalism that was taking place. What was going on? I've been reading the German War, and the German War is basically the perspective of everyday Germans as everything was falling apart. In the sense of the Soviet Union, what was going on with the average Russian, meaning just the day-to-day life in regards to the perspective of the public itself? As Bill Clinton was working with Boris Yeltsin to basically pick over the corpse and laugh over the bones of the previous Soviet Union. How were people thinking about it as that shock capitalism was taking place?
Well, I think that at the time, the Russian people were profoundly demoralized and disoriented because I can speak also from personal experience because I grew up in a communist country, and let's say that through most of the 80s, particularly the later half, the second half of the 1980s, it was very clear that the socialist system is going to implode, that it was unsustainable, and that a change would have to come. We had high hopes that capitalism would deliver us, that we would have a better life, that we would have greater prosperity, more opportunities, and so forth. Because that's the way it looked from where we stood. We looked at the West. The Western world was wealthy, prosperous, freer than we were, and so forth. And so we expected that the advice coming from the West, the consultants coming from the West, the companies investing who came from the West and invested, that they would help us. That they genuinely wanted our societies to be more prosperous. But this was not the case. Basically, the whole project was plunder. But I think that in the Russian case, it was far worse than anywhere else, and it was one of the greatest peacetime tragedies ever recorded. It was the longest and deepest depression recorded in the 20th century. Russia, which now has about, I think, 144 million people, had registered between 4 and 6 million excess deaths during those 10 years.
Alex, I really apologize to you. We're going to have to bring you back on to have a deeper conversation on this, because I am fascinated by this very specific topic. But we're joined by Alex Craner, author of The Great Deception and hedge fund manager. Alex, I really do apologize, because this is a conversation I'm dramatically interested in. But we'll definitely have you back. This is Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with Margaret Kimberly.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can always catch us on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking it in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Last but not least, if you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like, a share. Also, you can join this conversation with a tweet, a chat, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Look, one of the policy positions that Donald Trump has taken, and has assiduously taken actually, for the most part, is pulling out of various places that we're in, either in Syria-ish. Of course, he's stealing the oil and destroying the crops. That's a whole nother story. But also in Afghanistan, the United States has been in that war for likely 20 years, and they have been lying remorselessly in regards to how bad that war has been going. Trump has been trying to create a deal with Afghanistan and the Taliban in order to extricate the United States from that situation. What do you know? Russia is apparently bribing Taliban to kill Americans. That story ends up being the impetus to try to keep the United States in that war for a longer period of time. To discuss, we are joined by senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret Kimberly, welcome to the show. I always enjoy having you on. I hope you're doing all right.
I am doing fine. Thank you. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. So I've been somewhat enamored by the way the public sucks down these type of allegations, especially the quote-unquote coincidental way in which they, and the timing to which they come out. Trump tries to pull out of Afghanistan. He's in a campaign. He wants to keep his campaign promises, so he's trying to extricate himself from the situation. Just like when he said, I'm going to pull out of Syria, lo and behold, intelligence gets leaked that somehow complicates that process. What do you think of this story? I mean, basically, they're saying that the Taliban was being paid by Russia for bounties in order to kill Americans. They even doubled down on this, despite the fact that all principal actors that were involved in this said this was basically lunacy. How do you view this, Margaret? What's your take on this?
Well, I never believed it. From the moment I heard it, I knew it was a lie. I'm just going to go out on that limb and say it is not true. It doesn't make any sense. But first of all, the Taliban have been fighting the U.S. since 2001. They don't need encouragement from Russia to fight Americans. That's what they've been doing. Actually, there have been fewer U.S. deaths the last couple of years than there were under Obama, and I think that's a result of the peace talks. Who was the source of this story? anonymous intelligence sources. That could be anyone. That could be no one. Somebody definitely did plant the story. Someone with ties to the Democrats, to Obama, I'm sure. Because, these people go in and out of the intelligence agencies. So, and they have partisan leanings one way or the other. Or it could just be made up, but we don't know who it was. And that's the problem with this anonymous source business. Sources should be anonymous if they're whistleblowers, if they need to be protected. No one else should be anonymous. And the fact that that's the only source given, and when they were pushed, the New York Times, they were the ones who broke this so-called story. All they could do was say, well, other newspapers confirm. The Washington Post confirms what we said. So they just are covering for each other. That's not a source either. So if Trump succeeds in drawing down any troops from Afghanistan after nearly 20 years, he will have pulled off a coup, and he will have something that will help his election chances. So, of course, what a perfect time to scuttle the talks, another opportunity to make Russia out to be the boogeyman, another opportunity to propagandize people who have already been propagandized against Russia. Everything that we have been told about Russia, all the major charges in Russiagate have been proven false, every single one. Under oath, CrowdStrike said they couldn't prove that anybody hacked their computers at the DNC. We were told Michael Cohen went to Prague. He never went to Prague. Who was convicted?
Wait, just to interrupt
Manafort
for 1 second there. Just to interrupt 1 second there. On that point, you're talking about basically the president of CrowdStrike, the CEO of CrowdStrike, in congressional testimony being very clear. We have no proof that Russia did it, but they hid that. They hid that for like 2 or 3 years after that testimony had taken place.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And it's presented as fact. And if you ask most people, they would say that that was true. But look what they've done. The allegation is repeated endlessly for several years. And then once this testimony was declassified, unless you're, I call myself a Russiagate nerd, unless you are looking for the information and know where to look, you have no idea that that's true. So now with this Taliban story, now they're backtracking, and I think they also do this on purpose. Now, according to Aaron Mate yesterday, the story now in the New York Times is on page A19, and now they're saying there are people who disagree, and there are people who think it's not true, and I'm like, really? You're kidding me, right? But so that is what has happened. They make the big push. And in the minds of most people now, this is true. It is true that the Taliban took money from Russia to kill Americans. It's true that Trump knew about it and didn't do anything. It's true that Trump's a traitor. It's true that Putin tells him what to do. People don't know anything about the fact that the U.S. does sanction Russia. Trump added sanctions against Russia. Trump has pulled the U.S. out of treaties that Russia is a party to, that Russia wants it to stay in. So the Trump is sanctioning countries that are Russia's allies, Venezuela and Iran. So this idea that he does everything Putin tells him to do is just a lie. But they have to keep telling it. It's for election purposes. It has the larger purpose of being war propaganda against Russia. But if you pay attention, you will see that there's nothing there.
There's something to be said, too, also for what was taking place back in during the time for George Bush. It's like media never quite learns. In Syria, again, little to no evidence. Assad killed his people with chemical attacks, and all of a sudden that becomes flat fact, despite the fact that when pressed on that, General Mathis, in congressional testimony, basically said, yeah, it's complicated that we're there, and we're still looking for evidence that this took place. Nevertheless, in the minds of people, like you say, it becomes fact. It's a press almost taking on a political stance of putting out a story and then biking away from the story, allowing the story to be in the public consciousness while simultaneously saying, well, I mean, we did add these caveats later on when nobody was watching. One of the things I also want to point out, Dick Cheney Dick Cheney used to plant stories back during the war, the lead up to the war. And then he would turn around and reference the anonymous source stories that he himself put out as evidence of his story. You would think that the media has gotten used to that. And yet that doesn't seem to be the case that they have gotten used to at all. With this taking place, do you think Trump is going to be able to get these troops out? I mean, the Democrats are basically working with what they say, Liz Cheney of all people, in order to pretty much put the kibosh on them doing that. I mean, this is extraordinary that they're taking these actions.
Yeah, as you pointed out, the United States is destroying food, destroying wheat fields in Syria. That's a war crime, by the way. All the sanctions are war crimes. Collective punishment against the civilian population is a war crime. And no one says anything about it. It's true. They brag about doing it. Everyone knows it's true. There's all sorts of evidence, and they don't say anything, but they all leap on this lie. But as your question about the media sort of implies that they are impartial actors, and they are not. The corporate media sign on to, they're part of the neoliberal imperialist power structure. And they also want, they usually want access. Now, Trump is unusual and they don't want access with him. They're trying to get rid of him and get the imperialists they like better, a Democrat. So they want an imperialist with a smiley face, I guess. They are not, they're not independent actors in these stories. Did the New York Times show any skepticism in the run-up to the Iraq War? No. They were pro-war. When Colin Powell was at the UN holding up a vial of something that represented anthrax and showing pictures of trucks and claiming there were mobile labs, I knew it was a lie, and I didn't mind saying, I was like, this is BS. But the New York Times treated it as though it was true. The Washington Post treated it as though it was true. Republicans and Democrats in Congress treated it as though it was true. So this is actually an old story. These establishment newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, lest we forget, the Washington Post, especially now, is owned by the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, who also does business with the CIA. When it comes to stories about the surveillance state, about foreign policy, that is something that has to be kept in mind. They are not credible sources in these instances.
Why do we still find them credible then? This is Shane here. Great to have you on, Margaret. Good to meet you. Good to talk. Why do we still engage with them? What do you think is the barrier there? I mean, there are these new forms of media. We can call the old media legacy media, whatever term we want to use. And there are these new forms of media that you'd think, optimistically, would have some chance of puncturing that media bubble, this overinflated bag of lies. Why do you think that hasn't been successful so far? And what can we do to try to make that successful, to try to puncture that?
I think it's that's what most people still rely on. You have to know where to look. You have to have the thought that this may not be true. So you have to have the information. You have to be skeptical. You have to know where to look. You have to have the inclination to look. And so what is true is hard to find. What the lie is easy to find. It's easy to turn on CNN or MSNBC. It's easy to assume the New York Times and NPR are telling the truth, because, and also this is a product of media consolidation that happened under Bill Clinton. There used to be many more media sources, many more newspapers. Before he got rid of those regulations, you couldn't own a newspaper and a TV station in the same city. So there might be a TV station that had one point of view and a newspaper that had a different point of view. So we have media in fewer and fewer hands. And it's easy to do with Trump because people want to get rid of him. People hate him, and they are primed to believe anything that shows him in a negative light. And it's been the perfect crime. They just have they built up Russiagate. Now, Trump, of course, being Trump, he didn't help himself any with that stupid phone call with the Ukrainian president. Then the whole Ukraine, he resuscitated Russiagate single-handedly when it was dead after Mueller's disastrous testimony last July. So he brings it up himself. He makes himself the target again. We go through months and months of hearing that he's a traitor, he's Putin's stooge. And so people believe that. So when you have these pauses, when it's not in the news, it's still in the back of most people's minds. And I think that's what makes it so difficult, that these individuals who have credibility are also part of the lie. And you have to, and the media aren't going to tell on themselves. They're a part of these lies. They're not going to, the New York Times has never owned up to what it did to help facilitate Bush invading Iraq.
Let me interrupt you for one moment. We're going to be back. We're going to be coming right back with you. We're going to stay with this conversation about media. We're joined with Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. We'll be back in a moment. Thomas and Stranahan, Fault Lines.
Fault Lines.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser for Double Down, new show on Sputnik with Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert. Everybody's doubling down. Central bankers are doubling down. Gambleholics are doubling down. Everyone's doubling down. Why don't you double down? Right here at Sputnik with a new show called Double Down with Max and Stacey. Bye, y'all.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly is the editor-in-chief. She is the senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She can check out at blackagendareport.com. She's also the author of Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret, we're closing out that last segment talking about the media. You mentioned Bill Clinton's reforms, whatever word we want to use for this. I was 3 years old at the time, so I fondly remember these reforms passing. Okay, maybe not. This is 1996, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And just reading about this, it's interesting because they say the goal of the law was, quote, to let anyone enter any communications business, to let any communications business compete in any market against any other, end quote. So that sounds as a hint of something horrible sort of lurking at the edges of that. But in itself, it sounds like, okay, more competition, that sounds better. But from what you're saying, it sounds like this just set up the potential for these larger monopolies to form. Is that sort of the takeaway here?
Yes, it is. And now there are only 6 companies. Anything you hear on media is probably being produced by just one of 6 corporations. And there used to be hundreds of radio stations. And I mean, the stations still exist, but they're owned by this small group of corporations. So that, for example, here in New York City, Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post. At that time, that meant he could not also have had Fox News in New York City because he had a newspaper already. But you see how they covered it up. They made it look like, that sounds like a good thing. Anybody can have media anywhere they want. But in fact, just the opposite is true. So then we have Rupert Murdoch has New York Post, and he has Fox as well. So this is not a good thing. They and most of these corporations, none of them have a leftist point of view. MSNBC, that people think of it as the liberal network, but it's owned by Comcast. At one point, it was owned by General Electric, a defense contractor, and they all have a partisan point of view. So these outlets that push the Democratic Party point of view are not speaking on behalf of the people. You see how quickly they jumped on this story and spread another lie on top of the lies they have told for the past few years. And I think and they are also, by the way, I don't know if you both have noticed, they're all pushing this story that Biden will win and in a landslide, which I think is highly unlikely. It's possible for him to win. But a lot of this is just anti-Trump, and they're trying to, as always, cover up, or they're even covering up for Trump. Trump is starving people. It's U.S. foreign policy. These sanctions starve people. They kill people. And the press say nothing. The Democrats say nothing. No one, a small group of people who do not have a large base of media base to inform the public. We're the only ones who say anything. So Democrats will pile on a lie, but the truth about what Trump does around the world that makes people suffer is something that they support, and that the big media support, and the people know nothing about it.
I am so glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. I always ask this question, are they lying or are they incompetent? And, I asked this question when I first started my show because it was one of the impetus for me on the reasons I started. Legacy media, as you say, is not non-biased. And even the framing of non-bias or objectivity is somewhat of a lie, because everybody, regardless of who they are, put their stake down of priorities and rationale down somewhere, and in the way that they pursue and analyze the world. For all of this consternation, you're right also with mainstream media. I mean, think back for MSNBC for the moment. Cenk Uygur worked there. Cenk Uygur talks about having the talk where mainstream media, MSNBC, basically tells him you're being too hard on our guests and you need to, mellow out a bit, and basically tries to give him all of this money to take on the job for him to not be antagonistic and be adversarial to the congressman who he brings on. Krista Ball. Krista Ball is in our even area. I think she's across the hall from us in our studio. She also talks about when she did a story basically going after Hillary Clinton, exposing truth, flat fact story, that they basically said, we need to put a monitor on you from here on out so you can have your stories, checked. Not that you can't say whatever you want, but the stories need to be checked just to be on the safe side. Again, she was being to some degree muzzled, where she made it clear that they understood where her priorities needed to lie. Ed Schultz was fired from MSNBC for covering what he said he believed to be Sanders. So it's like mainstream media has a point of view and a framing of the world to which they go by. Also, you pointed out Trump and the various things that he's been doing against Russia. Trump also armed the Ukraine, something that Obama just would not do. Now, the catch becomes, as you so astutely pointed out, that they will go after Trump on certain issues, but on other issues, they give him a blind, blank slate pass. So Syrian crops, they don't even mention it. The fact that he is literally trying to starve a country into submission, it doesn't come up. Stealing the oil doesn't come up. The sanctions on Iran, not a big issue. And even when you get into this notion of murdering Yemenis with the Saudis, it doesn't come up as an issue of concern. Like, they are it's like state media, but it's state media under a corporate moniker. From your experience, are they lying? Are they just unaware of these stories that are out there? Or is it one of those things of they just pick and choose in regards to what they put out in the interests of the state? Meaning they would argue that it's not so much that the United States did anything bad intentionally, but more so just an accident. Do they take that perspective as just an ideological blind spot? Or are they actively and intentionally lying in regards to the way they present stories, ignoring this type of behavior abroad?
They are actively and intentionally lying. They know where their bread is. I think some people come in and they're willing to do whatever they need to do in order to advance themselves. And the handwriting's on the wall. It's pretty clear. Most people are conformists. So even if you wanted to do real news, I'm sure it becomes clear very quickly that that's not the way to advance oneself. So you have some people who are true believers, some people who just take the path of least resistance, but the end result is lies, intentional lies. They have the information that the fact that CrowdStrike, that the testimony was declassified, and CrowdStrike said they couldn't prove that Russia or anybody hacked the DNC, should have been a huge headline. It should have been a huge story. But unless you're inclined to pay attention to that anyway, you had no idea that it happened. So I believe it's intentional. I don't give these people any credit at all. It's a miracle when any truth actually is revealed by these people, and their complicity means that it is doubly hard for the truth to come out, because they are the ones who should be telling us. They are the ones who should have told us that this was CrowdStrike's testimony, but they were the ones who pushed the Russiagate narrative, so they would, in effect, be telling on themselves, and that means it's not going to happen. But I don't give them any credit. The late Ed Schultz, as you said, he wanted to cover Bernie Sanders' announcement, his campaign kickoff in 2015 or 2016, and he was told, you're not doing it. And eventually he was fired. They fired Phil Donahue back in the early O's at the time of the Iraq War. He had the highest rated show on MSNBC at the time, but they got rid of him because he was allowing guests to come on who expressed skepticism about the Iraq War narrative. So these people are intentional. These people are willing participants in this system, and they should be treated as such.
Another aspect of this, Margaret, thank you again for joining us. I want to quickly follow up on this thing. I know I'm fixated on this. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, just a brief comment there. It had another short title, and I just thought this was gloriously Orwellian. The short title is Communications Decency Act of 1996. So just a little bit of equivocation. Yeah, a little bit of trying to apply a bit too much makeup to a too obviously something that's a pig. But another side of this, again, just sort of swiveling a little bit, CrowdStrike is such a horrifying name. I don't know why I haven't heard people talking about that. What the hell is that supposed to imply? It's just that. Again, like you're saying, published a series of reports mid to late 2016, widely rebuked, I would say widely, but no, it was selectively rebuked, tactically rebuked, sort of surgically rebuked by the people in the know, but that wasn't picked up anywhere. Again, they're still lauded, although a little bit more quietly, as this organization doing competent work, but like you're saying, it just seems like we're sustaining their reputation because they helped to create a sort of soft casus belli against Russia. Just this morning, I see Russia addressing the OSCE, pushing back against Ukraine, against the Euromaidan. Again, a State Department-backed revolution we instigated in Ukraine, mobilizing pre-existing disagreements in the country. We made that happen. So there's this set of actions which, if anybody were to look into them plainly, they would immediately find abhorrent. And you'd think that this would get picked up pretty quickly in a fair judicial media system that had this back and forth. But it seems like all opposition to these movements, anything that's supporting these pushes for militarism, is swept up in this wave. And this is, we're going into the last couple of minutes of our conversation here. I'm grateful that you've joined us, grateful that we have this platform, and I'm grateful that you have your platform too to try to speak about these issues. And I'm just trying to close out. Any optimism, any way that we can sort of continue to push for this truth, continue to mobilize, any advice as somebody who's been in this for a bit and has your experience and perspective coming to somebody, I'm first 3-4 weeks trying here, any takeaways for somebody who's trying to get this stuff out there?
Yeah, just keep trying to do it. We cannot give up. We have to have some glimmer of hope. We have to have some optimism. We have to keep doing what we're doing. And there are people paying attention here and around the world. That's why they want to shut us up, because they know if people hear a different point of view, they will pay attention to that point of view. So as hard as it may be pushing against these powerful forces, we just have to keep doing it. It may sound egotistical to say the world needs us, but I don't believe that's any exaggeration. Any effort to fight against this propaganda, that's what it is. It's just propaganda. State propaganda on behalf of the state or on behalf of one wing of the state is something that has to be exposed. We are up against it. That is true, but we have to just keep doing it, and we have to organize people as much as we can and get information out as best we can.
Margaret, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. One last quick closing comment here. This is me. You use the word propaganda. Propaganda relates to propagate. This might seem like I'm going somewhere pretty weird. I think we have a media monoculture right now. The lies, the nature of the lies, the nature of the system that's supporting these lies is pretty homogeneous. It's pretty self-identical. And that exposes it in some ways, because everything's the same, because all these perspectives are the same, that exposes it to the weaknesses that you see in monocultural crops. If you can have a truth, if you can have a mechanism for generating truth and for disproving lies, there's a potential for a tipping point where that whole edifice gets brought down, and hopefully we can make something more positive come up on the other side. Regardless, we're going out. One more hour coming up. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it's time for another hour of the show that brings you the most truth of any other show in existence. In the independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the unapologetically lefty corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last bleeding man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are the disembodied duo, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I've been meaning to ask you about that disembodied thing, but I think we should save that for after the headlines. I don't know if that's a threat.
Fair enough.
I don't want to take that as a threat. Regardless, in the headlines today, first up, the Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that state faithless elector laws are constitutional. These laws would allow states to remove or fine electoral college delegates who don't vote for the presidential candidate they were pledged to support. In the UK has passed a raft of new sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against 49 officials in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and North Korea. We talked about this with Alex Craner in the last hour at 8:15. Go back for more info there. But just to do a quick recap, just over half of those officials are in Russia, where they targeted 25 individuals they associated with the death in prison of Russian tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky. Most notably in Russia, they targeted the top prosecutor, again, Russia's top prosecutor, Alexander Bostrykin. In Saudi Arabia, they targeted 6 former and current officials they tied to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. In Myanmar, their most notable target was Min Aung Hlaing. I'm probably getting that wrong, pronunciation there, but he is the current commander of Myanmar's armed forces. And in North Korea, their only named target was Kim Jong-ho, a senior official they said was in charge of the country's prison system. The UN is warning that the novel coronavirus pandemic is causing serious disruptions to HIV treatments in many parts of the world. This is due to shipments from medical supplies being disrupted by broken supply chains. In California, they're delaying the state assembly's return to work after Democrat Autumn Burke of Marina del Rey and 4 others who work in the building tested positive for coronavirus. Meanwhile, in Georgia, Atlanta's mayor Keisha Bottoms has tested positive for COVID-19, although she said she has no symptoms. She is seen as a possible candidate for Joe Biden's VP pick. In a brief spate of sports news, in football, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes may have signed the most lucrative contract extension in history. And in baseball, the Nationals and the Astros, the 2 teams in last year's World Series, have each canceled training camp workouts today due to delays in coronavirus testing results. Stock markets in Asia ended low yesterday. Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 dropped 0.4%. South Korea's Kospi lost early gains to decline nearly 1%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng dropped 0.7%, while the Shanghai Composite gained 1.2%. In sort of related news, TikTok has joined a list of social media platforms withdrawing from Hong Kong. They're joining Facebook, Google, and Twitter. They're doing this over worries that they will be held culpable for individuals identified by the government as dissidents, specifically for the actions of those individuals. Just want to make that clear. This also comes as last night on Fox News, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, said that he was considering, the administration was considering banning Chinese apps, including TikTok. That would affect a lot of Zoomers. That would probably be a bad move generationally speaking. But that's That's almost beside the point. In our last story today, a judge on Monday ordered the Dakota Access Pipeline shut down for additional environmental review. This is more than 3 years after it began pumping oil. This also would be handing a victory. This is handing a victory to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and it's delivering a blow to President Donald Trump's efforts to weaken public health and environmental protections his administration has viewed as obstacles to business. I'm going to wrap it there. You've been listening to Headlines, and you're still listening, hopefully, to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, we're coming out of that. Okay, we could go so many places here. I want to give a quick shout out to the last great conversations we've had. Again, if you haven't been listening in, you want to catch up. At 7:30, we were talking with Miko Paulette about Israelis' plans for annexation of Palestinian territories. We're also talking about Israeli influence on the American education system. He gave us a couple teasers there. Hopefully, we'll have more on that soon. At 8:15, almost an hour ago, we spoke with Alex Craner, a little bit too briefly, sadly, but we were talking about the UK's new Magnitsky sanctions. Then, right after that, we just finished a conversation with Margaret Kimberley about Russia and U.S. antagonism towards Russia, and the sort of media suppression complex that unfortunately we're all operating within in the United States and much of the Western Hemisphere. Next up at 9:30, we're going to be joined by Eleanor Goldfield. She's going to be telling us about her documentary, Hard Road of Hope. It's about West Virginian strip mining, hilltop removal. We're going to be talking about the environmental effects, the history there, as well as the economic impacts that's had on communities in West Virginia. Anyway, that's my sort of announcing, voice mode where I'm giving you the table of contents for the show. A bunch of different directions we could go in, Jamarl. You want to get back to the capitalism socialism thing? Or go for it.
Wait,
oh
let me
yeah, that's
explain
the thing.
disembodied. So the reason I said disembodied is because technically I'm here, and if people could see me, whereas we just have a picture of yours, and so they could hear your voice, they could kind of see just the mugshot, but you're not there. It's not presence. That's all. That's what I mean by disembodied. It's like he's here, but he's also ever present.
I'm still going to take that as a threat, Jamarl.
What?
No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to get a rise. No, that's
disembodied. Yeah.
I mean, we are.
No, that's not a threat.
Yes,
Yeah,
sleeping hollow.
technically we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, by definition.
No, totally. Technically, that's the thing. This whole internet complex thing. Digital disembodiment. That could be a book or a band name or something.
Digital disembodiment. That's it. Digital disembodiment. One thing that I do want to talk about, I want to complain about Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo, as you know, in New York, governor of New York, at one point, Democrats were trying to draft him into the party, and they were like, yeah, we need somebody else because they don't think Joe Biden can carry the burden. They were willing to do Bloomberg, but they ended up with Cuomo. Cuomo is sitting in New York responsible for like 20,000 deaths. Let's be very clear. Cuomo, who also was responsible for slipping in an amendment or slipping in a provision to protect nursing homes, those nursing homes which became death traps, as Cuomo ensured that testing couldn't take place on residents he was shoving into those areas. Now, nursing homes have gotten to the point where they're dumping people in order to make a profit by bringing in additional government funds as opposed to people who can't necessarily pay. So putting those people in homeless shelters or just kicking those people on the streets. Now, despite all of that, Cuomo failed miserably. Nevertheless, Cuomo is still out here attacking Trump. Let's play this clip. Let's listen to Cuomo have his anger fest at Donald Trump over COVID-19 response.
A phased reopening is better than reopening and closing. That is not just a premise. It's been proven by the past experience. Look at the states that reopened recklessly and are now closing again. Who did that help? It actually set us back. So, Mr. President, don't be a co-conspirator of COVID. Do one simple thing. Acknowledge to the American people that COVID exists. It is a major problem. It's going to continue until we admit it and each of us stands up to do our part.
Donald Trump has never said COVID didn't exist. He might have lied and said that, the Chinese, as soon as they got on an airplane, it just spread all across America. The moment that they got into the plane and wheels went up. He may lie about that, but he has not made any thing saying it doesn't exist. He may try to ignore it. He may live in this kind of emancipatory denialism. All of that's true, but he hasn't said it didn't exist. I mean, after all, you have a CDC, you have Fauci, you have all of these guys talking about it. So it's not that. I think I take issue with this because Cuomo is infinitely culpable for the deaths in New York. I mean, Cuomo closed a week behind California, and that week has the difference of thousands of lives. And then when Cuomo was asked, hey, is there anything that you could have done differently? Is there any situation where you have maybe deaths on your conscience? How do you sleep at night? He said, I sleep fine because, I don't think there's any deaths that I could have prevented that I didn't prevent. You're responsible for thousands of deaths. Your reaction to this, you're slow-footing, closing the economy. The information that was gathered in California was sent to Cuomo, and it still took extra time for him to close. New York has like 10 and 20,000 deaths. Do you realize 42% of all the deaths that happen from COVID-19 happen in nursing homes? Those same nursing homes that Cuomo shoved those people in while all of a sudden also stopping the ability to test and then providing protections for those nursing homes. This man is infinitely responsible for many of those deaths in New York. And now he's sitting here trying to throw the ball at Donald Trump saying, admit that COVID exists. Get out of here. You admit that COVID exists. You do that. And you deal with the tens of thousands of deaths that your state under your leadership has basically allowed. Shane, thank you for allowing me to complain about that because Cuomo is sitting here as if I've done everything right and now I'm going after Trump. Nobody. That condemnative finger needs to be pointed back at you. You failed miserably. That's where I'm at. That's my rant. I'm annoyed.
Man, you are. I'm smoking over here. Not literally. I'm smoking over here by the mic just because you're so fiery, man. That was a lot of heat coming off. No. I mean, I agree. I mean, here's a weird conspiracy theory. Maybe it's not even technically a conspiracy theory. I don't know what kind of word I should use other than conspiracy for this kind of theory. But
call it a hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. My hypothesis here. Cuomo's doing pretty well, as far as I can tell, reputation-wise. His polling numbers seem pretty good. What if there's this weird system of perverse incentives where governors around the country kind of have this incentive to fail at dealing with COVID because they're going to be seen as leaders struggling to manage this crisis? I just heard somebody say that, and just this idea, I don't know. Incentives do such terrible things if we're not aware of them.
They do. Yeah, they do. They have horrible consequences sometimes. So yeah, I agree with you on that. So wait, also, that's the idea that basically they're letting it crash in order to... Now, I would agree with you on this part. I don't know about the COVID thing, because sometimes when it's too close to home, people can blame like local governments in their response. But I agree with you entirely on issues of the economy. Like when I said this months ago, when Nancy Pelosi went out, and Nancy Pelosi would basically pass anything that Trump does. And then they would pass a showpiece of a bill that has no opportunity for passing at all, meaning in the House of Representatives. She's just being opposition, but she's being weak, feckless opposition. But I would wager that part of that weak and fecklessness is basically to say Trump failed on his own merits. So Pelosi, in this kind of scorched earth politics, and the Democrats in Congress basically are, yes, weak and ineffective in general, but in this very specific case, weak and ineffective because they don't want to give Donald Trump any potential for a win. They want him to drown in his own incompetence, which basically, unfortunately, means a lot of people dying from COVID and a lot of people being materially harmed. But from their standpoint, that helps them politically to make their argument against Trump.
I agree. You know, you're familiar with the ship of fools thing from Plato? This idea?
No. What's the ship of fools? Go for it.
So ship of fools is this parable about a bunch of people on this ship, and the person who's supposed to be steering the ship is blind. He has skill though, but he's blind. I might use the word they. I think that's the more current thing than he. But regardless, they're steering the ship, but they're blind, and so they need the help of the people on the ship to help them steer the ship. And everybody on the ship is a fool. They're arguing about things that have nothing to do with steering ships. They're just infighting, basically. It's just modern politics, effectively. And then eventually the implication is that the ship crashes somewhere. I think we have long ago thrown out the captain. There is nobody who's leading the ship. Yeah. Everybody's bickering. Everybody's arguing. You know, whether it's party politics or public politics, mass politics, any domain that we're operating on here, any level, it's all a mess. And in that wreckage, in the rubble that we're sort of living in, it's up to us to try to build something up. Now, it's hard because we're going to have to build on rubble. And it's not going to be easy clearing a place to build. But I don't know. That's my extended metaphor here. That's how I feel about this whole political process. Now, we can start that building while we're still living in this system. I don't think we need to wait. I don't think that anything needs to needs to be reserved. Maybe some things need to be reserved until there's some significant changes, some phase shifts, some would say. But regardless, there's stuff we can do now. That's what I'm really interested in. Now, what's hard about that is you start local, you start small, your impact is going to be small, and you're always going to be susceptible to these larger pressures. So there's that body of complications, but still, I think that's the right level to start on. Maybe we can continue this conversation.
Yeah.
Let's
continue it on the other side of it. Go for it.
Absolutely. We're going to be going into a break. Yep. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, specifically Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, and myself, Shane Stranahan. We're live right now, just outside of Washington, D.C., but if you're in D.C. or the wider D.C. area, you can hear us 105.FM, also 1390 AM, that's on the radio. Also in Kansas City, we're up on the air, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Alternatively, inversely, if you want to listen to us online, you can. We're on Periscope right now. Go over to twitter.com/faultlinesradio, and right up top, you'll see the live Periscope feed. You'll be able to hear the audio. No video there, unfortunately. We do, however, have video on YouTube. If you go to check out Jamarl Thomas, do a search for Jamarl Thomas, you'll find his channel. He is live there with video and with an image of my disembodied head. We are also, if you do a search for Fault Lines Radio, you can find us on the Fault Lines Radio channel. That's where we are. Oh, and Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartMusic, Spotify, Apple Music, a bunch of those places. Those kind of go up after the fact, though. Regardless, continuing this conversation, political delirium. That phrase just came to mind, and that seems to be where we are. You wanna take it, Jamarl?
Yeah, I like that. Political delirium. I love that. So it's something that you said, like the Plato's allegory, the blind, basically the blind leading the blind into a Titanic, into an iceberg. There's an allegory for that for Supernatural also. In Supernatural, one of the angels, the angel of the Lord, he's trapped. He's an archangel. And Dean, who is basically a prick, is engaging him in this kind of banter, almost like gloating. And he looks at him with all the compassion in the world, all of the angst and sadness that a being could contain. And he says, do you realize your situation? You're living in a godless world, boy. Now, his point in making that point, there's nobody manning the ship. Anything that happens is entirely, not necessarily accidental, but all of the incentives and the drives that lead you guys to these outcomes are the only thing that basically is keeping this chaotic system in place. And at some point, it's going to hit the skids. I love the allegory. I love the parallels for that. Last point, disembodied head. King George III. So, after they did a reading of the Declaration of Independence and all of these guys signed their name to basically what would have been a death warrant if they would have lost that war, they run out after reading, the colonists go from New York down to, what is it called? I can't think of the name of the place. Bowling Green. Go down to Bowling Green and rip the statue of King George from its pedestal. Now, they burn that, and they basically make bullets out of it. I think it was like 44,028 bullets. But they keep the head. They keep the head because they wanted to put the head on a pike at Fort Washington. Now, the significance of this is obvious. They're basically talking about beheading the king. The King George was bothered by this, and they were able to get loyalists to drag the head away back to England in safety. I don't know why. I find that story to be so funny, especially in the context of us talking about elections and these guys who are looking for this kind of political revolution and changing in our system. I love that. Let's go to a caller because Tarif was here before. Tarif, welcome back to the channel. Sorry we didn't get to your call the first time around. What's on the topic? What's the topic for today?
I have three comments, but before I go to those comments, Chuck Grassley seemed like he's on the road tweeting out, Yeah, he's on the Twitter storm. My first comment is dealing with an article that the Reuters put out, dealing with 239 scientists from 32 countries saying that the WHO need to revise their recommendations on how to deal with the coronavirus, COVID-19, because with these hundreds of scientists found out that the particles for coronavirus is smaller, and they're looking at it that it's airborne now. That is airborne. It's probably been airborne. So if it's airborne, that means that can change a lot of things, how the U.S. and China are seeing each other, pointing the finger at each other, And my second comment is dealing with Kanye West talking about running for president. That will hurt the DNC. Yeah, that will hurt the DNC more than it will hurt Trump. Yes, it would take black votes from Trump, but for the DNC, they would definitely take black votes from the DNC, Latinos and whites that's into hip hop that like Kanye West. So he would actually hurt DNC more than Trump. My final comment is Dale Bigtree 2 weeks ago was talking about the mask and hydroxychloroquine and COVID-19. That he's willing to go on shows, radio shows, and TV programs to discuss his topics and the evidence that he accumulated over time dealing with different sciences over the world, that he's willing to go on different radio programs and whatnot. And if people want to debate him, which is, if y'all want to, bring him on y'all show and y'all disagree with him, then, he's up for a debate too. I think that would be good. Well, it can be educational form, dealing with COVID-19 too. So that's all I want.
What's the guy's name? What's his name again? Just so we know.
Dale Bigtree, the High Wire.
And it's Dell. It's at DEL, not DALE. Yeah, I know it'd be great to have him on. Yeah, we'd probably disagree on stuff, but that's the whole point. We'd love to have those conversations. Thanks for the recommendation. And yeah, we should try to get him on soon. That'd be good. Also, on the Kanye thing. What about which part?
What do you think about it? All of it. Part? The Kanye West thing too, but definitely the other parts also.
Yeah, well, COVID-19 pandemic stuff is interesting. It's a whole bag of worms. What makes it such a bag of worms? We were talking about the media earlier with Margaret Kimberly and how everything is, you have lies being propagated as truths and truths being propagated as lies, all this stuff. There's this law in economics, Gresham's law. Basically, the bad money drives out the good. If you have bad money, if you have corrupted money, debased money, whatever the case, eventually, well, there are a few ways of looking at this, but the end result is that there will be less and less good money, less pure money, less, actual currency-based money, whatever that means, metallic money.
Explain that.
Anyway,
explain
here's
why
what I'm saying.
For that.
Well, I need to look into it deeper. The main understanding that I have is that, for one thing, there's an incentive to produce more bad money because it's cheaper to produce than good money. And the people who are aware of which money is good will tend to take that good money, pull it out of circulation, and save it because they recognize it as being valuable, and the general public who's using it doesn't. So I think the same thing can be applied. This is why I brought it in. It's maybe a little bit tangential, but I think the same thing can be applied to information. There's a Gresham's law of information too, and the media likes to propagate mistruths because they're valuable. They're profitable, literally. If you can get something that's hot and fiery out there, that's profitable. But also because they're politically profitable. Again, if you have a higher up in the political system that you're operating within who's kind of coming down on you, who would provide you connections for scoops in whichever bureaucratic agency or whatever, and they want you to say something, and if you don't say the thing or you don't not say the thing, they're going to cut you out. That creates this perverse incentive for misinformation. And the problem is, there are a couple ways of looking at this. The media complex and the public as these two separate spheres of engagement, neither of them have mechanisms for consistently finding what's true and discriminating from what's false. So that's this broad problem. And I'm kind of swerving around the COVID-19 stuff, but I want to come back to it. The problem that I have when I look at this is that I do not know how to trust all of the medical authorities that I would have gone to trust, like the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, that is the premier health organization of the world. Can't trust them. From the very beginning of this stuff, they've gotten things terribly wrong, including key officials coming out and saying things that contradicted what the organization itself was saying. The CDC in the United States, Fauci, Trump, any of our leaders, I don't know where to turn. And so I'm having to sort of operate on my own grounds and speak a little bit cautiously about this stuff, just because, if you say too much, then you're propagating something that's wrong. If you don't say enough, then you're not living up to your duty as a broadcaster. It's a difficult thing to navigate. That's my thought on the COVID-19 stuff. Anything there before we move on to Kanye?
I think the COVID-19 stuff is interesting. I think I partially agree with you. I think I partially agree on that one. It is difficult to try to figure out what's true, especially in a situation like this. I look at it kind of in a sense that science tries to expand its knowledge. So there's always this level of falsifiability built into whatever kind of science thing. I mean, that's kind of the best thing about science, right? That, religion, God is God is God. God is perfect, which means God has no capacity to change. The same book that you read 1,000 years ago might be the same book you read today. When they cobbled the Bible together. But you know what I mean. But science is not that way. Science is supposed to grow and expand. You had Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics gave way to this understanding that, okay, this doesn't function at uniformly all throughout the universe. If you're going at remarkable speeds, that relativistic factors come into play. And they're able to modify what they consider to be just the law of our universe in a way that that goes beyond just the way our common level of understanding does. So science has that benefit to it. I think your catch is Fauci didn't make a scientific thing, or for that matter, they were using political reasoning in regards to the way they were doing things. So I agree with you on that point. I get it of, okay, how do we trust somebody if they have a history of using political language to describe a particular situation? I do think Fauci's situation was particularly unique and different, which is why I give him a pass, because I do think we have shortages in these things because our government is incompetent. But I don't disagree with you on the COVID stuff. I do agree with you. It's difficult to find what's true. And short of that, it's like we're broadcasters. We have to say something, but we have to couch it to some degree because we don't necessarily know what's God's level truth. I agree.
And another perspective on this. No, totally, and I agree with your agreement. It's too much. We should stop. Another way to look at this is like from a sort of first principles perspective or something like that. We were just talking about truth. You have science, arguably philosophy, religion. All of these are aiming at truths, maybe different kinds of truths, but important truths that we need to understand. Now, what all of these systems, all of these bodies of thought, bodies of people trying to generate these thoughts, what they run up against in every case is they operate in a political system. That political system is predicated on power. And there's this inherent asymmetry between truth and power, where people in positions of power want to use truths. They want to suppress certain truths. People in positions of seeking truth, on the one hand, have to resist power, but on the other hand, they sort of have to buy into it if they're going to be able to keep their research or their thoughts going, to be able to spread that truth. And so with the exceptions of lone scientists and hermetic mystics, it's pretty hard for people to sustain their own pursuit of truth while living in a political system. And in those cases, they just completely moved out. The problem is, again, the question is, what is their impact going to be? If truth and power have this asymmetrical but sort of necessary contingent relationship where they're mutually contingent on each other, it's an open question, and I think we're going to have to ask it in different ways in different societies what form that relationship should take. Coming back to the specifics here with Fauci, it's too easy to get caught up in this one thing, so I don't think we should. But this is that conflict. He was saying a political statement. He was making a speech act that was trying to get people to take a certain action. And the problem with that is that there are parts of that that were either directly wrong in the case of the Surgeon General or misdirectionally wrong. They were incomplete, incorrect. And that's that fault line coming up. That's my thought.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. No, but there's no disagreement on that at all. I mean, it's almost like you're stuck in this box of, okay, I need to know what's true. I also need to know what the narrative is. And sometimes, like you said, truth intercedes or interrupts power because sometimes the truth is inconvenient. And when that truth is inconvenient, what is the incentive for power to do? Well, we know. We can see what they do in regards to hiding military secrets that aren't necessarily, that are things that the government or that the public should know, but that would be against the interests of power. So, no, I think you're perfectly right in your assessment. There's one thing, tell me if I'm wrong on this. where you made this argument about Gretchen's Law. Would an example be a company that's, say, dumping wasteful products? That waste in and of itself is somewhat of an expensive thing to do. It costs a lot of money in order to get rid of that waste. And so if you have, let's say, 5 different companies, one company decides I'm just going to dump it in the river and save on that cost of dumping, you create an incentive for the other companies to basically do the same, which is a bad behavior in order to maximize their profit. It could be competitive with the company that's basically cheating. Would that be an example of Gretchen's Law?
I would say that's related. It's a related issue, but I wouldn't say it's the same thing.
Okay.
But real quick, and I'm pretty sure there is a name for that. I just don't know enough political science or whatever to coin it, to bring it out of my hat. But another thing, we've been talking about truth and power. Those are sort of cold topics. Those are very valuable topics, but there's beauty, there's nobility, there's grace. There are all these other beautiful things in the world that I think we also need to be incorporating into our conversations. If it's only truth and it's only, I'm not even criticizing you. I'm not more criticizing myself. We need those too. We need that perspective, because that's when we have all of these things together. That's something like wisdom, and that allows us to negotiate these differences and use them constructively in our societies. That's my little end take. Regardless, though, we're going into a break here. We're going to be joined on the other side of this break by Eleanor Goldfield. She is the director, award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Common Ground. Her most recent documentary, which we're going to be talking about, is Hard Road of Hope, about past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. We'll be back with her in just a minute. Until then, know that you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Radio Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined now by Eleanor Goldfield. Again, if you didn't hear us just before the break, she is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, journalist. She's also the co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Her most recent documentary, we're going to be talking about this one today, is Hard Road of Hope. It covers the past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. You can also learn more about that documentary. If you want to check it out while we're talking about it, you can go to hardroadofhope.com. No spaces, nothing funky there, just hardroadofhope.com. You can also check out her Twitter account at Activist Eleanor. So just activist and then her name, Eleanor. All right, Eleanor, with all of that introduction out of the way, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
Good. Yeah, happy to have this conversation. Really appreciate Lee Camp sort of setting us up with you. And then our producer, Brennan, was bringing us different options about what we could be talking about, the environment, different issues that he told us you cared about. The thing that struck my eye, he brought up your documentary. I've been wanting to learn about West Virginia, learn about the hilltop mining, learn about the history there, the economic history, but also the political history, because that seems like where we would need to go if we want to see the terrible state that a lot of the portions of that state are in today. So can you please tell us, maybe I'm not sure exactly where to start, what brought you, why did you start pursuing this documentary? What got you interested in this? And I think we can go from there. That's a good start.
Sure. I mean, I think, when I started working on this film, I had a lot of people saying, but Eleanor, who cares about West Virginia? And I think that that's kind of the crux of the point here. West Virginia is known as a throwaway resource colony. It's known for, hillbillies and Trump voters and who cares, just like a bunch of opioid addicts. And it's been destroyed by coal and now fracking, so who cares? But the question is, if we were to discount an entire place because it's been destroyed by industry, and we were to discount people because they've been oppressed and propagandized, what part of the United States would you have left? And I think it's really telling that West Virginia has gone from a radical powerhouse in terms of the beginning of the 20th century, with workers' rights and coal miners banding together and marching and fighting for workers' rights, to kind of the butt end of jokes. You know, I grew up in North Carolina, and West Virginia was the butt end of jokes there. And if you're the butt end of jokes in North Carolina, something has really gone awry. So it was really about showing that West Virginia is more than just a microcosm of pain and suffering. It's a microcosm of our amputated radical history, and thereby people, when I've gotten people messaging me about the film and saying, "Wow, in Indiana and Ohio and California and Colorado, wow, this is my history too." And I think that really the power not only of connecting with our radical history, but recognizing the power in amputating a people from their radical history.
That's a beautiful setup.
Oh, no, go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. Thank you. That's a beautiful setup. I mean, a few things I know about West Virginia, and it's an emotional state for me. I've been through there only once, but I've read about it, and there are a few things that have caught my eye, which is why I wanted to talk with you about this. For one thing, as far as I know, it's the only state that is situated entirely within the Appalachian Mountain Range. It's just to give some context there. This is a sort of poetic image. The Appalachian Mountain Range, as far as I can tell, is the oldest extant mountain range in the world. So you have this state that's sort of, in some sense, the crown or something like that. It's sitting completely within this very, very old history that predates, again, all human contact with the region. And so we're sort of living on that legacy, which brings us to the ecological side of things. But then there's also, again, you were talking about this history of radicalism. A lot of people will talk about rednecks, hillbillies, whatever. But again, late 19th century, early 20th century, I'd love to hear more about that. And I think that's where we should go next. I know that there is this history. You referred to it as an amputated history. Why do you say that? And where do you think we should start if we're trying to understand what actually went down there?
Yeah, and you make a brilliant point. I mean, the Appalachian Mountains are in that area is known to be one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. It's absolutely breathtaking. For folks that have been through West Virginia, you'll know the hills and hollers are absolutely gorgeous. And it's also the second most rural state in the nation. It's the third poorest, and all of these are connected, of course, with how our the capitalist industrialized perspective on what can be used for the profit rather than for the good of people. And I think, I say the amputated history because people don't recognize even when we look at the founding of West Virginia as a state, for instance, people have these lovely, flowery stories about how West Virginia was founded because it wanted to be a slave-free state. But that's just simply not true. West Virginia was founded from a deal that was struck between Abraham Lincoln and the industrialists. Abraham Lincoln needed to keep supply lines open. And what were supply lines in those days? They were trains that moved timber and coal. And so he looked at these industrialists and he was like, look, if you keep my supply lines open, you get a state for your purposes. So really, when people say that West Virginia was founded as a resource colony, that's legitimately how it was founded. It had nothing to do with slavery. There were people in that part of what was then the western part of Virginia that were very happy to continue to own human beings and profit off of their labor. So this flowery idea is just, it doesn't vibe with evidence. And of course it doesn't vibe with the foundations of the United States, which of course are genocide and slavery. So that's the very beginning of that amputated past of West Virginia. But also, you mentioned the turn of the 20th century with the mine wars there. Basically, people were brought, directly from Ellis Island to West Virginia to work in coal towns. And they were separated. You had people saying, oh, don't talk to the black coal miners. They're savages. Don't talk to the Jews. They eat babies. Don't talk to the so-and-sos. They're, so all of these absurd and ridiculous, the tired and tripes that people have about other groups of people were really propagandized in, and a lot of these folks couldn't read. They were, afraid to connect to each other, and yet still they overcame these obstacles, these divide and conquer obstacles that were placed for them, and started organizing together. And what you have at the turn of the century, in the beginning of the 20th century in West Virginia, you have black and white coal miners marching together and actually taking up arms and firing on coal industry, bigwigs, and winning basic human rights, the rights to be paid in American money because they were paid with, coal industry script before then. And you have this gaining of some basic workers' rights that we still enjoy today. And, the idea that this happened in West Virginia, that black and white coal miners worked together, tied on red bandanas, which is where the term redneck comes from. It's actually a very radical term, so that they could recognize each other and take pride in their fighting for basic worker rights. And this has been completely propagandized and twisted, so that now redneck is a term for this right-wing extremist nutbag, as opposed to a radical person who fights for workers' rights and for human rights. So that's really what I mean when I say amputated, because it's really like you're missing a part of your person. You're missing a part of the body politic, so that you can't be an entire person if you don't understand where you came from. Because if you think about it on a personal level, you know who you are today because you know who you were before. And these people don't understand who they are today because of that antecedent history.
That's a good point. I mean, but that's that's almost for the entirety of the United States. You can make a case. I mean, when they talk about Martin Luther King, oftentimes they try to remove the radical and just talk about the racial stuff, like he was only into this racial politic. Missing the point, the guy was a socialist. The guy was absolutely invested in regards to what was taking place abroad, even though that might not necessarily have been in his own best interest. And even his own people were saying, why is this guy talking about this other stuff? Stick with these black issues. It removes part of you and it damages you in a particular way in doing so. I want to get into something else you said, the dollars, the dodgy dollars that the company tried to pay on. This gets to history also. I mean, in Guatemala, in the banana republics, when those companies went there and was basically buying up all the bananas and buying up the political body, buying up the infrastructure, the railways, all of these other things, and then tried to pay the people who were working there in basically corporate bucks, just like this place tried to do in the United States to West Virginia. That's astonishing. I'm so glad you said that. I want to get into this notion of the previous history. I think you're talking about the Matewan massacre, right? Where the coal miners basically marched on the company for reasons of economic unfairness, based on economic justice. They were shot down. There was like a war or miniature battle between these groups. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I was referring to the Matewan massacre as well as the Battle of Bear Mountain. Both of those, yeah.
Oh, interesting. So one thing, a question on this. The poverty levels in West Virginia. So I remember doing this kind of report on West Virginia, was shocked by the levels of poverty. 19.1%, they're fourth in the nation. Childhood poverty, 25.5%, meaning a fourth of the kids there are in poverty, dirt poor. That's 47th in the nation. Working age women, 22%. Working age men, 17%. These are the poverty levels in the country. African Americans, 31.7%. Asian, 19%. Latino, 24%. White, 18%. This is a state, despite all of the energy that they put into producing energy for the country, that is ensconced in poverty. Have there been any political solutions tailored to try to deal with the poverty in West Virginia? And for that matter, why has West Virginia flipped so fervently to be in the camp of the Republican Party?
Yeah, those are great questions. Basically, the issue with poverty is that they've done studies and some $5 trillion worth of coal has been mined out of the hills of West Virginia, the advent of coal. And yet, as you noted, Jamarl, it's the third most poor state in the United States. And that really speaks to the trickling up of profit that happens really in any industry. But because West Virginia has been so focused on just coal, there's no diversity of industry in West Virginia. It's always been coal, and now it's shifting to fracking. And that really speaks to why there hasn't been any new economic boom in West Virginia, because it's always industry. And what the film also talks about is this shift. King coal is dying and King oil and gas is rising in West Virginia. And so just like, again, with the propagandization, it's, if you like electricity, you'll see these bumper stickers all over West Virginia. If you like electricity, you like coal, as if there was only one way to get electricity. And this is the same argument. These are the same tactics that are now being used by the fracking industry. And there's an important point that's made in the film as well, because I talked to folks whose families have been coal miners. I talked to a former coal miner. It's important to recognize the choices that people have, or really the lack of choice. People are basically growing up in an area where your choice is to watch your family starve or to work in coal. And this is not a choice. And as I've noted and you've noted as well, these are choices that people face all over the country. I'm reminded of folks in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Okay, you can either work for Dow Chem or you can be homeless and starve. These are not choices, right? So it's important to recognize. And I think this is sometimes an issue that environmental activists have, is that they go into a place and they just start dumping on people that they're the problem. When in reality, that's not the problem. These aren't the people that are profiting off of the destruction. In reality, they are selling their own bodies to make a buck. Because cases of black lung have skyrocketed because of mountaintop removal, because of it's actually a lot more detrimental in a lot of ways because of the fine dust particles that are created in mountaintop removal. So this is really an issue of propagandization, and it's why you'll talk to people and they say, well, I don't trust Democrats, I don't trust Republicans, and why they perceive Trump as different. This was something that we saw in 2016. Oh, Hillary is the dynasty, Trump is different. Of course, that's not true. He is the billionaire class, but it's this perception. And that perception really speaks to the power of propaganda and how in the span of just a couple of generations, we went from people really holding tight to union membership dropping, and people thinking that unions are the problem, that regulations are the problem. When, as in the film, one of the former coal miners says, regulation
Eleanor,
is why you're running
Eleanor,
your mouth. Otherwise,
keep that thought. We're gonna flip over to the next segment. I mean, we have with you for another 15 minutes. This is Eleanor Goldfield, author, activist. We'll be right back in a moment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Eleanor Goldfield. I'm going to go right back to her, let her continue her thought. Just first, though, I want to give her props, give her credit. She's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, activist, journalist. She's also the co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. Her most recent documentary we're talking about today is Hard Road of Hope. You can learn more about that at hardroadofhope.com. Eleanor, hopefully you successfully put a pin on that. Can you please continue what you were talking about there?
And basically just the power of propagandization, and I think I was really it was good timing, Jamarl, because I was just wrapping up that thought. So, but really just Jamarl had asked why these folks tend to veer towards the Republican, and I think this really speaks to the power of propagandization, and that from redneck, poor white folks have gone from really recognizing and feeling with that solidarity with Black and brown folks to feeling that their power is that they are at least better than Black and brown folks, and that really speaks to that power of propagandization and the divide and conquer mentality that has been used by the coal industry in West Virginia, but really by all industry and by corporate power that oversees the political framework of our country.
Few directions we could go here. I agree. That's an interesting perspective, and part of it is that it's using West Virginia as a microcosm for a lot of the problems we're talking about on this show in the U.S. generally. We were earlier talking about North Dakota Access Pipeline leakages that came out soon after that was implemented, and earlier today the judge shutting that down, basically putting it on hold. There's also this conversation we were talking about with water seepage, with the pollutants from that pipeline leaking into the ground, affecting the water supply. I've heard that this has been an issue for a while, specifically during the early 70s, the mountaintop removal implementation, basically this process of, again, removing mountaintops in order to access the coal embedded within them, leaving these scarred, denuded faces. They look like bruises from the sky. Not to put too much into that, but it's true. Again, that's not it's not just an aesthetic thing. As far as I can tell, this also would have long-lasting consequences. Is that an issue? Was that something you were looking at in your documentary?
Oh, absolutely. And I was able to see the mountaintop removal from the sky because you can't really understand. First of all, they do a good job of trying to hide it. They'll do a tree line, trees along the roads. I won't really call them highways because there aren't a lot of highways in West Virginia. But these winding roads. So you really can't see. And even if you could, you can't conceive of what a 16-mile wide mountaintop removal site looks like from the ground. It just doesn't make sense. You really need to see it from the sky. And when you do, it's awful. What's happening is that they're decapitating these mountains. And we use the term decapitating because it's really like you're cutting off the head of a living being, because of course the top of the mountain is the source of the headwaters, and it's and basically what happens when they're blowing out off the top of the mountain is they're trying to get to coal seams because all of the easy to get to coal has already been extracted. Same thing with fracking. They're trying to get to the stuff that's difficult to get to. So basically what they do is then they dump all of the excess, and this is stuff that's filled with toxic chemicals, a heavy metal cocktail, and they'll create these unlined earthen dams in between mountains that they've blown the tops off of. You have what's called coal slurry impoundment, where these toxic metals are leaching into the water. So what started out as some of the most clean water in the world, because you have these natural charcoal filters, has now turned into poison water. And I mentioned that there's one place in West Virginia called Prenter, where 98% of the people living there developed gallbladder disease because of the poisoned water. There was a what they call the water crisis, several years ago, where a coal cleaning compound leached into the water supply. You could smell it for miles. It smelled like licorice, and this is absolutely a problem. And there have been studies, and I also talk about this in the film. There have been studies that show that people not even have any connection to the coal industry, these aren't workers, but just people who live in the region are being affected in very adverse ways because of the coal. And we also see this with fracking, of course. The methane, the chemicals used there that are still poisoning the water, the land, and the air. So it's really, a transition of power, if you will, from the coal industry to now fracking.
Is there no outlets for the people who are there? Meaning, right now, we have so many people in the streets all across the United States. And even though many of the people in the streets are for Black Lives Matter, I strongly suspect that a lot of those people are basically people who basically find something wrong. And they might have been Sanders supporters. They might have been people who actually incorporated this notion of, am I willing to fight for somebody in the way that I'm willing to fight for myself? And they throw their bodies into the streets. And I suspect strongly, to some degree, a lot of this has to do with the economic, let's call it rigidity, or the economic difficulties that the United States is dealing with. And a lot of that stuff gets supplemented into this particular issue, so these people are out on the streets. What is West Virginia's outlet for here? Because there doesn't seem to be a political solution to many of the issues that avail the United States, be it issues of poverty, be it issues of war and imperialism, or for that matter, just this cultural idea that the point of life is not necessarily the profit of a small body of human beings, that the point of life is whatever you basically decide that the point of life is, and we can have a life that is of health, human happiness, and human growth and development. What is the political outlet for the people in West Virginia to try to get them to, at the very least, glimmer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and there's a problem in West Virginia. If folks have ever been there, it is very rural. I mean, I've already mentioned the second most rural state, but people are very isolated, and this also speaks to, which I mentioned in the film, that it leads the country in the opioid epidemic, which, that's not a coveted first place spot. And this really, if you look at the triggers for addiction, it's isolation, both physical and, of course, mental and emotional. And trauma and stress. And that is really, that's West Virginia in a nutshell. And I think there's also this extreme culture, like, unfortunately, the propagandization of, twisting the term redneck. There's also the propagandization that you should take pride in your oppression, that you should take pride in the fact that you get black lung at the age of 35, which is, of course, absolutely sick. But it really speaks to this sort of, I'm this hardworking man and I can take it. And that's part of the culture there. And of course, because West Virginia has been a single industry place, there's this tying in of your identity to the coal industry. And that is a really difficult nut to crack. It's really difficult to separate people from something that they feel is part of their identity, which has made this very difficult even for people organizing on the ground as former coal miners, as people whose family is all coal miners. And so it really speaks to the importance of this grassroots organizing that is happening in West Virginia. I talk about this in the film as well, and the power of having people connect on that cultural and personal level, so that you don't have someone like me who isn't from West Virginia, whose parents didn't have anything to do with coal, but you have people saying, yeah, my grandfather started working in the mines when he was 10. I get it. Here's why we need to shift. And here's why it's important, not just for the environment, but for you and your family. And so it really is, I'd say the outlet is a bit more subdued than marching in the streets, partially because the streets are mostly gravel there, but also because, there's a recognition that that most of the change is not going to come from asking permission from the politicians, because the politicians are so steeped in coal and fracking that asking to petition them doesn't feel like the right outlet. It's more of this grassroots organizing and really building resistance and resolve to build something better in those communities.
Eleanor, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for laying this all out for us. Thanks for this conversation. We only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to sort of do another outro. We haven't really talked about your background. We've talked about this documentary. We mentioned Common Censored, the podcast you co-hosted with Lee Kemp. Can you tell us a bit more about what else you've done, where you're coming from, what else you're up to, just in the last couple of minutes before we close?
Sure, and I want to thank you guys so much for having me. So I'm a creative activist and a journalist. Right now I'm doing a lot of work with DC Mutual Aid, because mutual aid is a powerful, not only antidote, but answer to the ills of capitalism that we're all experiencing. And it is a community helping itself. So I'm working with that. I'm also continuing to write for various outlets, including Mint Press News, about mutual aid, but also, about things like struggle theater that we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening around the nation. Folks can find more about what I do over at artkillingapathy.com. It really speaks to the mediums that I use to try and promote change, not only on a large scale level, but also like on a very localized level, because I do believe that these smaller groups and smaller autonomous circles are really where we build the most power. And so that's over at artkillingapathy.com. And folks, please do check out the film. That's at hardroadofhope.com. And it's available on a sliding scale. And if people need financial assistance, please feel free to reach out to me. It's also available for screenings and for educational purposes and things like that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I just want to get this right. It's artkillingapathy.com. That's KILLINGAPATHY. So pretty much the standard spelling there, artkillingapathy.com. That's Eleanor's personal website. We were talking today about Hard Road of Hope, her most recent documentary. It's about the past and present radicalism in the resource colony known as the state of West Virginia. We were talking about that, the history there, the founding, concessions. That's a very interesting conversation. Eleanor is also an activist, a journalist, and she, as we mentioned, is a co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp. If you want to follow her, you can do so on Twitter at activist Eleanor. Eleanor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
All right, great show today. Thank you again. Great show today, Jamarl. Interesting stuff,
Absolutely.
man. This show is developing in a very interesting way. I'm just going to put it like that.
We have the smartest show easily on the network. That's where I'm at.
Oh man, we'll see. I don't know. We'll see.
It's a
about
really
that.
good show. It is extremely contemplative. It's extremely open-minded. No, it's a great show.
You know what? We need more callers. That's the only thing. And admittedly, we had Tarif, and then we pushed him off. We should have treated Tarif a little bit better. He had to call back in at 9:15, but at least we got him on. Regardless, though, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being a part of this. We'll be back again tomorrow. You've been listening to the most disruptive, most educational show in the universe, in the multiverse. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, as always, I really do appreciate you all joining us for the show. Yeah, I really do think this is one of the smartest shows on the network. I mean, Shane is extremely bright. He comes at this at a way of... it's funny, when Shane and I had the opportunity to talk, every time we got the chance to talk, it always gets into these kind of esoteric, contemplative topics. And it's like adding that into a political dimension gets really interesting in regards to the results that you get. And after doing this for maybe a couple of weeks, I think this works. And I think it's a really, really good show in regards to the way we talk about this stuff. So, yeah, the show is developing in an interesting way. And we had to do this without ever having dry runs together, with Shane not necessarily doing the radio, and with all of us being basically in our own silos. I think we've done an amazing job, and the show is doing exceptionally well. So I want to thank you all for allowing that to basically work and to be a part of that process. We're definitely trying to grow the show, so definitely like, share it, if you do indeed dig it. And we'll be here Monday through Friday, 7 to 10, to basically get you kickstarted for your morning. So definitely keep in touch. We will be hitting these stories and doing the news like we've been doing for the past several weeks together. I understand, honestly, that the changeover from Garland and Lee is somewhat shocking in regards to how fast it took place. But we do try to some degree, do some level of service to the people who came before us in regards to the channel. And hopefully we've been able to do that. But definitely having our own take and point of view, while at the same token trying to keep it within the context of fault lines. So that's what our goal has been. And I think for some, in most regards, the tweaks and the pushes that we've made along the way in order to try to make the show work has indeed worked. So I can't complain. I appreciate Shane for being on the show. I think this ended up being a really good match. And I appreciate our producer. I think all of us make an extraordinarily good team. So far, so good. I'm going to say like, share. I had technical issues yesterday, but you would definitely see me today. Mainstream media allows for the establishment to cover Obama-Biden-gate. Yes. Xavier Fawcett. Yes. I agree with that. Xavier Fawcett. They're going to arrest if Trump wins. Oh, now that's interesting. Now the catch becomes, does mainstream media or does the Democratic Party all of a sudden lose concern if Donald Trump wins the race and they just move on to something else? I don't know. That's a good question. Sometimes the momentum in and of itself politically has certain outcomes that are untethered from the people who eventually start them. Meaning, yes, they might have initiated a process. Yes, they might have nursed and propagated a process long, but at a certain point, they don't care as much. And the people who took that at face value are still running with the same logic and momentum that took place from the people who basically, let's say, stovepiped that into their political discussions. It could have consequences. I mean, Russiagate had consequences. That was done for political ends, but you had something where they tried to soft coup a president of the United States. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. So I don't know what happens if Biden wins. I would say, though, if Biden wins, I have a hard time believing that Republicans hold on to the Senate. By the same token, if Trump wins, I have a hard time believing that Democrats hold on to the House. So we're in this kind of weird mix where everything is up for grabs. It's exciting, to say the least. Not to mention 10,000 people on the streets. So I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to say like, share, subscribe. I'm going to be back probably in 10 minutes because I have a few shows that I want to get in. We weren't able to do contributor appreciation yesterday because my keyboard was accidentally destroyed and I need the ability to basically engage. So I had to go trekking around yesterday for equipment. But new keyboard, new mouse, it's more silent, is what it is. So I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for Fault Lines. Still not accustomed to that yet. It's still weird to me. I have to get some kind of signage for the t-shirts and whatnot. But whatever concerns I had, basically unfounded. And the show has done extremely well. So I'm going to say like, share, and of course subscribe.